what if the moral compass you use to try and be a quote unquote good person is actually the exact thing destroying your ability to find any lasting meaning in your life?
It's a deeply unsettling premise.
It is. I mean, just think about that for a moment. We spend our entire lives meticulously following this map to some promised paradise,
Right.
whether that's a literal heaven or some moral utopia, or even just the quiet satisfaction of believing you're on the right side of history.
Hmm.
But imagine walking for miles, just totally exhausted, only to slowly realize that the map wasn't drawn by a master explorer who had actually seen the destination.
It was drawn by someone terrified of the dark.
Exactly. Someone who just wanted to keep you walking in a straight, predictable line. And when you finally understand that the destination doesn't even exist, you don't just lose your way. You lose the very reason you started walking in the first place.
Because the journey itself is suddenly exposed as pointless.
Right. Today, we're opening a text that requires us to quietly, rigorously dismantle the scaffolding of our own most deeply held values. The book is Friedrich Nietzsche's The Will to Power.
And it is an incredibly heavy undertaking.
It really is. It presents this unflinching vision of human history, focusing on the inevitable, creeping triumph of a concept that shadows all of our daily routines, which is nihilism.
Yes.
So, this broadcast is an invitation for you to just sit in a quiet, analytical space with us and really examine the absolute root of human meaning.
And we really must approach this with surgical precision, because the book posits that nihilism is already an active resident in our cultural subconscious.
It's already here.
It's already here,
Yeah.
but we have to strip away our normal, everyday understanding of the word. The book, it defines nihilism not as some gloomy mood.
Right. It's not just the angst of some disenchanted teenager listening to sad music.
Exactly. It defines it as a catastrophic historical moment. It is the specific point in time when the highest values are losing their value.
Wow. The highest values are losing their value.
Right. It's the moment when humanity looks up at the sky, asks the ultimate question, to what purpose? And the universe just remains violently, deafeningly silent.
That silence, I mean, to truly comprehend the weight of that silence, we have to look at the psychological architecture humanity constructed to fend off the void in the first place.
The defenses we built.
Yeah, the book meticulously breaks down the historical categories we invented just to give this chaotic universe a sense of worth.
And it starts with the category of purpose.
Right. We convinced ourselves there was a final goal to all this chaotic becoming and perishing. Essentially, we created a divine teleology.
Which is really just a philosophical term for a very comforting illusion.
It is. It's the illusion that history is a conveyor belt, moving us towards some grand, predetermined finish line,
Right.
like ultimate justice or spiritual salvation.
But then when that concept of purpose felt too distant, or maybe too abstract to soothe our immediate daily suffering, we leaned heavily on another category.
The category of unity.
Exactly. We imagined this grand organizing whole in which the individual fundamentally participates.
So we told ourselves that despite our apparent insignificance, we are a small but essential gear in a vast divine machine.
Yes, and that psychological mechanism is crucial. It allowed human beings to surrender their terrifying individual freedom and the anxiety that comes with it to a supreme administrative power.
Right. It's so much easier to just wallow in the general idea of a highest ruling entity.
Because it effectively masks our profound vulnerability to chance.
So we invented a destination and we invented a system to belong to. But even that wasn't enough, was it?
No, because the physical world is still full of disease, heartbreak, and injustice. It's still messy.
So we invented a third category, truth.
We created a real metaphysical world.
We adopted concepts like pure forms, the idea that there is a perfect, unchanging reality behind the curtain of our messy physical one.
A world where everything finally makes sense.
Right. We built our entire psychological universe on those pillars: purpose, unity, and truth. Which brings us right back to that map I mentioned at the start.
The painted cardboard foundation.
Exactly. Imagine living in a house your entire life, only to slowly realize the foundation is just painted cardboard. The moment you realize these categories were just psychological inventions.
Tools designed merely to help early human communities survive the brutal unpredictability of nature.
The architecture just collapses. The values we falsely projected into the cosmos are stripped away, and the world suddenly appears totally worthless.
And the psychological crisis triggered by this realization is absolute.
It has to be.
The book argues that we have measured the worth of the world according to categories that apply only to a purely fictitious reality.
Which means the actual world we live in suddenly fails our test.
Precisely. When we can no longer assign a grand narrative to existence, when we recognize that the universe has no immanent spirit, meaning it possesses no built-in soul or consciousness guiding it, we are left staring into a terrifying abyss.
We realize the universe is just entirely indifferent.
The process of becoming has been aiming at nothing. We are completely untethered.
Well, wait, I need to wrap my head around the mechanics of how we actually got to this untethered state. Because if you ask someone today where nihilism comes from, they might point to secularism or the rise of algorithms or, modern moral decay.
They usually blame the modern world, yes.
Right. But the text argues the exact opposite. It argues that nihilism actually harbors in the heart of Christian morals.
It's a brilliant historical paradox.
How? How does the exact moral structure designed to give life meaning mutate into the disease that destroys it? I mean, if morality was the cure for despair, how did it become the poison?
To understand that, we have to examine the original utility of morality. In its inception, moral hypotheses actually saved humanity from absolute despair.
They were necessary.
Absolutely. Morality granted an intrinsic value to the suffering individual. It rescued the weak from the crushing realization of their insignificance in the brutal flux of time.
It explained away evil and pain as part of a divine plan.
Exactly. It provided absolute truths and a reason to endure. It was a life-saving scaffolding.
It was a survival mechanism. It kept people from just giving up when their crops failed or their cities burned. But that still leaves the question of the mutation.
Right, how the cure becomes the poison.
Yes.
The book outlines a devastatingly logical progression. Morality championed a specific virtue above all others,
Truthfulness.
the virtue of truthfulness. It demanded rigorous honesty, intense self-interrogation, and an unwavering commitment to the truth at all costs.
So, no lying to God, no lying to yourself.
Right. And over centuries, this highly developed, almost fanatical sense of truthfulness became deeply ingrained in the human intellect.
It basically evolved into the scientific method, didn't it?
Yes, it became the drive for empirical evidence and intellectual integrity. But eventually, this refined, unforgiving sense of truthfulness turned its analytical lens backward.
Onto morality and religion themselves.
Precisely.
So, we train ourselves for centuries to demand absolute truth, and eventually we turn that microscope on the very religion that taught us to seek truth in the first place.
And the demand for honesty becomes so acute that it ultimately exposes the myths of religion, the miracles, the divine plans, the pure forms, as total fictions.
The magnifying glass of truthfulness burns the very hand that held it.
The ultimate recoil stroke of the fanatical belief that God is truth is the devastating, empirically driven realization that all is false.
Wow, all is false.
The very truthfulness nurtured by Christian morality ultimately revolts against the falsehoods and fictitious interpretations of the world that Christianity relies upon.
So morality essentially philosophized itself out of existence.
It's a process of dissolution driven not by a lack of morals, but by our own highly cultivated moralized need for truth.
That's incredible. And because we have exposed those moral values as fictions, we now have to face the biological and physiological consequences of that realization.
Yes, which leads directly into the book's radical critique of society.
The text introduces this concept of decadence, which encompasses decay, decline, and biological waste. And it really forces us to completely alter our perspective on what we consider societal problems.
The book argues, with clinical detachment, that everything society traditionally treats as the causes of degeneration are, in fact, merely its effects.
We are constantly confusing the symptom with the underlying disease.
We are.
Let's ground this in a rigorous medical analogy. Think of a doctor disastrously misdiagnosing a patient. If you have a severe underlying systemic infection, a high fever is a symptom of that infection.
The fever is just your body's panicked reaction.
Right. It is not the root pathogen. According to the book, modern society spends all its time trying to outlaw the fever.
We look at things like vice, crime, rampant anxiety, hysteria,
Even widespread addiction, and we treat these behaviors as the root causes of societal collapse. We completely ignore the profound spiritual and physiological exhaustion that is actually gestating them.
and that physiological exhaustion is the very essence of decadence.
How does the book explain that exhaustion exactly?
It maintains that this decay is a natural, unavoidable consequence of vital growth. A society, much like a biological organism, is simply not at liberty to remain perpetually young and vigorous.
It ages, it tires out.
Yes. When the vital energy of a society begins to wane, when its internal powers of resistance are broken by centuries of domestication and the suppression of natural instincts, the resulting exhaustion manifests as a weakness of the will.
So the multitude of human instincts just disintegrate and lose their coordination.
Therefore, what we label as moral corruption or viciousness is really just the inability of an exhausted nervous system to resist external stimuli.
So the addict or the criminal is not necessarily morally evil.
No, their physiological makeup has simply lost the internal strength to organize its own drives.
Which implies that all of our modern moral cures are completely misguided.
Completely.
I mean, the text has this scathing, almost surgical critique of things we normally celebrate, like altruism, extreme pity, and the overwhelming desire for absolute peace.
It suggests these are not elevated virtues at all.
They're demands made by the weak and the exhausted. By constantly preaching pity and self-sacrifice, society is just applying a localized anesthetic to numb the pain of existence.
While failing entirely to cure the underlying biological and spiritual decay.
It's a terrifying thought that our virtues are just symptoms of our fatigue.
Well, the exhausted individual inherently belittles and disfigures everything they see. Because they lack the superabundance of life required to bestow value onto the world, they impoverish the worth of the world.
They want to make the world smaller, quieter, safer.
Exactly. They demand a state of affairs in which suffering shall cease, primarily because they no longer possess the internal fortitude to endure it.
So they elevate peace, altruism, and passivity to the status of ultimate virtues.
And the book warns us that this is merely the survival strategy of the decaying. It is an insidious, subconscious attempt by the physiologically exhausted to make their own weakness the standard of value for all of humanity.
They literally rebrand their weakening as virtue. This connects so deeply to how individuals behave right now, today, when they realize the overarching meaning of their life has evaporated. Because nihilism, according to the book, isn't just one monolithic reaction, is it?
No, it bifurcates into two distinct paths, and it's entirely dependent on the physiological and spiritual strength of the person facing the void.
Right. The book categorizes the response to the loss of meaning into passive nihilism and active nihilism.
Let's look at passive nihilism first.
Yeah, let's dissect that, because this feels incredibly relevant to the modern exhaustion we just analyzed. You can see this everywhere today, in the urge to endlessly doom scroll, the phenomenon of quiet quitting, or even the obsession with self-care that functions more like a retreat from reality than actual healing.
Passive nihilism is the direct philosophical expression of that exhaustion.
It's just fatigue.
It's a sign of profound spiritual decline. The weary soul realizes there is no grand purpose, no metaphysical truth, and no divine unity. But lacking the vital overflowing energy to create any new values, this type of spirit seeks an escape into nothingness.
It just wants to check out.
It yearns for anesthetics, for cheap emotional intoxication, or for a quiet, undisturbed surrender. The book likens this to a Western form of Buddhism, a total abdication of the will to live, where the highest conceivable goal is simply the absence of pain.
It is a slow, comfortable fade into the dark, just swathed in pity and resignation. But then there is active nihilism,
which the text describes as a sign of enhanced spiritual strength.
This is an over-rich life, a powerful intellect that realizes the old values are dead and rotting. And rather than mourning them or trying to preserve them in museums, it actively, even violently, clears them away.
It destroys the remnants of the old fictitious world to make room for something new.
Active nihilism is the destructive force of a strong mind that refuses to be satisfied with mere passive disbelief.
Annihilation by the reasoning faculty is backed by annihilation by the deed. It is a necessary clearing of the brush, driven by an excess of vitality that can no longer be contained within fragile, outdated moral frameworks.
Hold on, I have to push back on this.
Go ahead.
If active nihilism requires violently clearing away all established values, aren't we just endorsing societal collapse? I mean, how is burning down the house a hygienic solution? We rely on those established values to maintain basic human cooperation and order.
It's a fair question, but the book views this destruction not as a chaotic end in itself. It views it as a biologically necessary prelude
A prelude to what?
to health. The values being destroyed are already rotting. They are the decadent, life-denying values of an exhausted era. To preserve them out of a mere desire for comfort and safety is to allow the infection to spread and further degenerate the human type.
So you have to cut out the rot.
The strong spirit recognizes that this decay must be accelerated and purged so that a stronger, healthier human spirit can eventually take root in clean soil. It is a profoundly dangerous transition, yes, but a biologically and spiritually necessary one if humanity is to overcome its present state of sickness.
Which brings us to what is undoubtedly the most paralyzing thought experiment in the entire text. It is the ultimate stress test.
The eternal recurrence.
Yes. It's a psychological filter designed to separate out those who possess that necessary world-building spiritual strength from those who are merely exhausted.
It is formulated as the extremist form of nihilism.
Can you lay it out for us?
The book asks us to imagine our physical existence exactly as it is, entirely stripped of any final goal, stripped of any hidden meaning, climax, or eternal salvation. Now imagine this exact existence inevitably repeating itself on an infinite loop for all eternity, down to the smallest detail.
Let me frame this for you, the listener, to truly capture the gravity of the physics of this idea. Imagine being handed a remarkably dense, unedited book that details your exact life.
Every single moment.
Every moment of transcendent joy, every agonizing sorrow, every instance of mundane boredom, bitter failure, and quiet, burning humiliation. Now imagine being told you must read it out loud, cover to cover, and when you finish the final syllable, you must turn back to page 1 and begin again. Forever. There is no heaven to look forward to after the reading. There is no grand historical progression you are contributing to. You cannot alter a single comma. Every mistake you made will be made again infinitely. Could you endure the crushing weight of that infinite repetition?
Is a psychological way that demands absolute, terrifying affirmation of reality.
It really is terrifying.
The book explains how this concept acts as the great divider of humanity. Historically, our moralities and religions protected the weak from this terrifying reality by promising a beyond, or a final, peaceful resolution where the pain would finally make sense.
So without that moral comfort, the weak whom the text refers to as the botched and bungled, meaning those whose psychological survival depends entirely on external validation and the promise of a better tomorrow, they perish.
They perish from the sheer weight of meaninglessness. They simply cannot justify their own suffering if it serves no ultimate purpose outside of itself.
So the people who need a reason for their pain are crushed by it, but the strong can endure this loop.
Yes. Only the strongest, most moderate, and most healthy can survive the thought of eternal recurrence.
Who are these people?
These are individuals who do not require extreme forms of belief or the promise of utopian futures. They can embrace chance, withstand profound sorrow without breaking, and justify their own existence entirely from within their own will.
They don't need the universe to give them a gold star.
Exactly. They can look at the eternal recurrence, look at the supreme humiliations and the fleeting joys, and say a resounding yes to life, exactly as it is. They become their own source of value.
That rigorous requirement for internal strength stands in glaring, almost painful contrast to the world we actually inhabit today.
It does.
The book brings this philosophy crashing into the present day with a scathing critique of what it calls modernity. It paints a portrait of an era drowning in its own nervous exhaustion, masking its decay as technological or moral progress.
The symptoms of modern gloominess are pervasive and clinically detailed in the text.
Like what?
Well, there is a profound hypersensitivity, an inability to assimilate the massive, rapid influx of daily impressions.
Information overload.
Yes, the modern soul is fragmented. We see it in the frantic need for constant new stimuli, in the restless, violent, helter-skelter pace of life, where everyone instinctively guards against actually digesting any profound experience.
Because digesting it would require stillness we can no longer tolerate. If we sit still, we have to look into the void.
Precisely. And the text has absolutely no patience for what it refers to as the parasites of intellect.
Right. It points out how modern society is completely bloated with middlemen. I mean, think about our current landscape. We are surrounded by reaction content creators, endless commentators, analysts, and critics.
These are people who do not create original values or profound art.
No, they merely react, analyze, and consume the intellectual capital of their ancestors. They live at the expense of those who actually possess original intellect. They are the ultimate expression of reactive rather than active energy.
And to explain how this reactive class operates, The book introduces the concept of modern mummery.
Modern mummery, like a masquerade.
Exactly. It details how modern people drape themselves in big words and moral finery to mask their fundamental lack of willpower and internal discipline.
We use grand words like toleration, objectivity, and pity.
We claim to be objective because we are actually too weak to have a defining personality or a strong, commanding will that takes a definitive stance.
And we claim to be tolerant because we lack the capacity to say an authoritative yes or no to anything.
It is a grand societal masquerade.
We dress up our spiritual exhaustion as elevated, enlightened virtue, the romanticizing of the oppressed, the constant sentimentality, the endless pursuit of comfort and safety above all else. The book exposes all of it as the ultimate symptom of a decaying era.
It's all a smokescreen.
We are merely hiding our profound fatigue behind the banners of philanthropy, equality, and social justice. We call ourselves good when in reality we are just too exhausted to be anything else. We don't have the energy to be dangerous, so we call our harmlessness a moral triumph.
To engage with this philosophy is to undergo a radical reevaluation. It is to realize that the very ideals we thought were elevating our species, our delicate morality, our fanatical pursuit of truth, our deep well of pity for the suffering, might actually be the symptoms of our own profound physiological and spiritual exhaustion.
It demands that we strip away the comforting illusions we have built around ourselves. It leaves us standing on the bare earth, stripped of the map, staring directly into the mechanics of our own empty values. And so, I leave this entirely with you. Look closely at your own daily routines. Look at your own fatigue, your reliance on the constant, numbing influx of news and entertainment, your participation in the easy, moral outrage of the modern herd. Are you merely experiencing the passive nihilism of a decaying era, desperately trying to drug the pain of a purposeless existence with comfort and distraction? Or do you possess the underlying, undeniable strength to look at the terrifying blank slate of a world without any inherent meaning and actively will your own values into existence? Let us examine this underlying concept of progress, because the assertion presented here, it forces a complete dismantling of modern civilization's most guarded foundational myth. I mean, you and I, along with almost everyone listening, we operate on this deeply ingrained, almost biological assumption that chronological time moving forward inherently equates to human advancement, right?
Right. It's a very comforting paradigm. We've been conditioned to view human history through the lens of this technological teleology.
Okay, let's unpack this because it's a fascinating way to look at it. We like to think of human history as like a smartphone getting a software update every century. It's always becoming more optimized.
Exactly. Like transitioning from the 16th century to the 18th century is perceived exactly like upgrading from, iOS 15 to iOS 16.
Right.
We just assume the barbarism and the superstitious bugs of the Dark Ages are being systematically patched.
Yeah, that the moral interface of society is just running smoother, cleaner, and more rationally. But the book systematically dismantles this as a profound optical illusion. Mankind, it argues, doesn't advance in any cohesive or engineered trajectory at all.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
It claims the 19th century demonstrates absolutely no inherent superiority or advancement over the 16th century. If you look at the entirety of human history through the analytical framework provided in the book, it doesn't resemble a sterile, progressing tech company in the slightest.
Right. It's instead this massive, chaotic, and entirely disorganized laboratory. There is no master engineer rolling out moral software updates.
No master engineer. You simply have a blind, irrational scientist in the dark, violently throwing chemical compounds at a wall.
Yep.
It's an experimenting workshop where an incalculable number of biological and cultural structures fail disastrously.
And a microscopic few just happen to succeed by sheer chance. There's absolutely no logic, no coordination, and no overarching responsibility guiding the chaos.
Precisely. And when you analyze the comparative deconstruction of the 18th and 19th centuries within the book, that teleological illusion, that comforting idea of the master engineer, it completely evaporates.
Because the 18th century provides the perfect case study of a civilization basically lying to itself about its own progress, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. This was the era dominated by Cartesian rationalism, which falsely cleaved the human mind from his animal body. And of course by Rousseau's romanticism, which gave way to a gushing, completely irrational sentimentality.
So the 18th century really convinced itself that it was the ultimate software update. It worshipped this highly sanitized, entirely artificial concept of nature.
Yes, it operated on the naive assumption that humans were inherently benevolent and rational. The thought was that if we could only strip away the superficial corruption of aristocratic society, humanity would, organically return to a pure, moral, and idyllic forest of brotherhood.
But the book exposes this as a massive, self-congratulatory delusion. It's just a desperate attempt to mask the underlying chaos of human drives.
That's exactly what it is. And when the text transitions its analysis to the 19th century, the era defined by Schopenhauerian realism and a much more subterranean animalistic view of man, it notes a severe psychological shift.
The 19th century is undeniably more fatalistic, right? It's characterized by this profound gloom, a creeping paralysis of will, and just a pervasive atmosphere of decay.
It is. Yet the philosophy dictates that this era is paradoxically better simply because it's finally intellectually honest. It has violently stripped away the idealistic, altruistic lies of the 18th century.
So it no longer bows in pathetic reverence to the sanitized abstractions of reason or the heart.
Right. It forces humanity to acknowledge the brutal, unvarnished reality of physiological desires and the absolute dominance of sheer, indifferent facts over comforting moral fictions.
But if the 19th century is finally discarding those Rousseau-esque illusions and embracing a stark, unfiltered realism about human nature, we're forced to confront a deeply uncomfortable paradox here.
Which is the manifestation of that honesty.
Yes. Why does that newfound honesty manifest as such profound cultural despair? If stripping away lies is inherently liberating, why does this societal awakening look indistinguishable from civilizational collapse?
It's a great question because we are conditioned to equate truth with psychological liberation and societal flourishing. But the reality presented here equates truth with a spreading cloud of nihilism.
Wait, how can societal decay and depression be a good thing? I mean, to comprehend this, is it like a fever?
A fever? How do you mean?
Well, when your body is infiltrated by a severe infection, your hypothalamus dramatically raises your internal core temperature. Your muscles ache violently, you shiver uncontrollably, and you experience absolute physical misery.
Ah, I see where you're going with this.
Right. From a subjective standpoint, it feels as though the pathogen is winning and your entire biological system is shutting down. But medically speaking, that decay, that shivering, isn't the disease destroying you. It is your own immune system creating a deliberately hostile environment to burn off the infection.
That is a phenomenal way to frame it. The misery itself is the exact mechanism of your salvation. The question is whether this cultural pessimism is the disease or the fever burning it out.
Exactly.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the physiological architecture of that fever analogy is deeply accurate. But to fully grasp the argument, we must be incredibly precise about what exact pathogen is being burned off.
It's not an external threat, is it?
No, not at all. It is the internalized, accumulated mass of 2,000 years of artificial moral valuations. The book explicitly posits that all abundant, genuine growth involves a concomitant, necessary process of crumbling to bits and decay.
You cannot have biological or cultural expansion without equal destruction.
Precisely. Suffering and the visible symptoms of civilizational decline belong intrinsically to ages of enormous chaotic progress. Every genuinely fruitful and powerful forward movement of mankind has always necessitated a concurrent nihilistic movement to clear the ground.
So therefore, the extreme pessimism of the 19th century, the terrifying realization that everything polite, elegant, and ideal is breaking down, is not a terminal societal disease.
Right. It is the visible symptom of a process of incisive, ruthless growth. Mankind is transitioning blindly and painfully into completely new conditions of existence.
And the text forcefully warns us that true naturalness is absolutely nothing like the peaceful, virtuous forest Rousseau imagined, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Nature possesses no inherent aspiration toward virtue. To be truly natural means daring to be as profoundly immoral, as aggressively brutal, and as chillingly indifferent as the physical universe itself.
Wow, so what you were witnessing in this pervasive gloom is humanity finally emancipating itself from the inherited priestly bourgeois notions of morality.
Yes, and that awakening, that metabolic burning off of a millennia-old infection, is agonizingly painful. It requires the destruction of the very values that previously gave human life its comforting, albeit false, meaning.
But if this civilizational fever is simply the agonizing, necessary process of shedding an artificial moral skin, it forces a deeply uncomfortable question about historical causality.
How did the skin get there in the first place?
Exactly. If we are naturally brutal, indifferent, and driven by immense physiological power, why did humanity volunteer to be sick? Where did this infection of self-denying moral ideals originate?
This is where the text pivots into a devastating psychological deconstruction of the origins of religion, aiming directly at the primitive human mind.
Right, because it argues that early humans, who obviously possessed absolutely no understanding of neurology or psychology, would occasionally experience sudden, overwhelming states of the soul.
Imagine existing as a primitive human and suddenly being struck by an extreme, blinding surge of aggressive passion. Or conversely, an unexplainable immense feeling of deep, transcendent peace.
Or even a terrifying surge of physical and spiritual power during conflict.
Exactly. And because these early humans felt fundamentally small, vulnerable, and unworthy in the face of a hostile natural world, they simply lacked the cognitive framework to believe they themselves were the biological originators of these magnificent feelings.
Consequently, they suffered what the book diagnoses as an alteration of personality, right? They
Right.
literally fractured their own psychological identity.
They did. The weak, pitiful, trembling, predictable part of their existence they labeled man. And the strong, awe-inspiring, unpredictable part of their own psyche they externalized, amputated from themselves, and attributed to an invisible, omnipotent entity hovering above them.
Which they called God.
Precisely.
So what does this all mean? If we translate this into a modern context, it's essentially imposter syndrome on a species-wide scale.
Imposter syndrome. That's a fascinating way to put it.
I mean, think about it. You sit down in an empty room, you sweat, you bleed, you dedicate your entire nervous system to a piano, and you compose a brilliant, transcendent symphony. But instead of standing up and declaring, I am a genius, I created this from my own biological power, you are so terrified by the sheer magnitude of your own greatness that you claim, a muse visited me, a divine spirit took control of my hands.
You actively surrender the credit for your own masterpiece because the psychological burden of wearing the crown of your own capability is simply too terrifying to bear.
Exactly.
What's fascinating here is that psychological self-abasement is traced throughout the text with surgical, almost clinical precision. To truly understand the tragedy of this dynamic, you must inhabit the deeply flawed epistemology of primitive man as outlined in the book.
Which was based on a very strict, unyielding assumption about cause and effect, right?
Yes, the assumption was all changes in state are effects, and absolutely all effects require a conscious external agent. Because these sudden surges of adrenaline or profound peace were not consciously premeditated or willed by the individual, they simply washed over the nervous system involuntarily.
So primitive man drew a disastrously flawed logical conclusion. I did not consciously will this state, therefore I cannot possibly be the cause.
Exactly. The book argues that the entire psychological origin of the God concept is simply a transient state of the human soul, personified and projected outward as an external cause, solely to satisfy this primitive need for an agent.
And the text utilizes a striking physiological comparison to hammer this home, doesn't it?
It does. It says, just as a sick man who feels one of his limbs become unaccountably numb and heavy irrationally concludes that another man must be physically sitting on it, the ingenuous religious man divides his own nervous system in two.
He deliberately impoverished his own psychological capital in order to enrich his imaginary deity. I mean, think about the implications of this for a moment.
They are staggering.
All the beauty, all the sublimity, all the overwhelming power, and all the staggering intellect we have worshipped for millennia in the heavens is, in reality, just alienated human property.
We lavished the absolute best of our biological and psychological gifts upon a phantom, entirely to make ourselves feel wretched, small, and dependent. We extracted the absolute apex of human potential, slapped the label divine upon it, locked it in the sky, and left only the pathetic, trembling scraps to define humanity.
But when a species systematically externalizes its own supreme power and projects it into an imaginary phantom, it inadvertently engineers a massive, highly exploitable psychological vacuum here on Earth.
A massive vacuum.
Okay.
Because all absolute authority, all justification for life, had been relocated into the sky.
And the brutal logic of power dictates that whoever successfully claims the exclusive right to translate the sky's will inherently controls the physical world.
Which brings us directly to the book's concept of the holy lie and the calculated rise of the priestly caste.
Right, because historically you have certain shrewd groups of people, whether it is the ancient priests, philosophers operating like Plato, or the architects of the ancient Indian law book of Manu.
who realize a profound political truth. You can wield ultimate, unquestionable totalitarian power without ever needing to forge a single physical weapon or command a standing army.
You simply have to establish yourself as the sole, indispensable mediator between this systematically impoverished humanity and their omnipotent, externalized God. It's like a protection racket.
A protection racket.
Yeah, the underlying mechanism operates exactly like a mob protection racket, but with a terrifying psychological upgrade. Imagine a mobster walks into your completely safe, functional bakery, violently smashes your display window with a baseball bat, and says, "This is a very dangerous neighborhood, but if you pay me a weekly fee, I will protect you from the danger."
Right, the mobster invents the threat to sell you the security.
Exactly. The priest executes this exact same extortion, but upon the human soul. The priest convinces you that your completely natural, biologically necessary human instincts, your aggressive passions, your intellectual pride, your sensuality, your ambition to conquer, are not just dangerous, but are an absolute cosmic crime against the fabric of the universe itself.
He invents a metaphysical disease, labels it sin, and then brilliantly sets himself up as the sole authorized physician who possesses the exclusive cure.
And the protection fee he extracts is not capital. It is the absolute, unquestioning obedience of your entire cognitive and physical existence.
The protection racket analogy captures the economic extortion of the dynamic perfectly, but we must look closer at the text to understand the profound psychological subversion that makes it permanent.
Because a mobster only takes your money, right? You still retain the cognitive awareness that you are being robbed.
Precisely. The priest, however, takes your cognitive agency. The book is incredibly explicit that this was not some innocent, unconscious, organic cultural development. This was the result of cold-blooded, highly calculated reflection by the priestly caste.
They realized that to maintain absolute dominance, they needed to establish a domain of power that could never be empirically verified, tested, or challenged by human experience.
Therefore, they invented the beyond, a terrifying, unfalsifiable system of ultimate punishment and reward occurring entirely after physical death. A realm where absolutely no human being could ever check the validity of their claims.
And by establishing this invisible architecture, they completely unhinged human reason from reality.
They really did. Before the intervention of the priest, primitive human reason relied on tangible, natural cause and effect. If I execute this action, it physically harms my life. If I execute that action, it promotes my biological flourishing.
But the priest violently severed that natural connection and replaced it with moral cause and effect.
Yes, an action's value was no longer measured by its real-world results, its health, or its vitality, but exclusively by whether it pleased or angered the priest's invisible God, which, conveniently, only the priest could interpret.
And to solidify this artificial hierarchy, the book explains that the priests were forced to create a structural foil. They engineered the concept of the Chandala.
The Chandala, yes. A despised, utterly untouchable underclass that represented everything the priests claimed to abhor. You cannot define absolute, impassible purity without simultaneously creating a contrasting, untouchable filth.
So by making the natural, instinctual life of the Chandala as culturally contemptible as possible, the priests successfully elevated their own highly artificial anti-biological virtues.
Virtues like physical inactivity, emotional impassibility, fasting, and the complete absence of passion. They elevated these as the absolute highest standard of human perfection. They literally built an entire societal hierarchy based on a fabricated anti-natural reality, where sickness was labeled divine and health was labeled sinful.
Now, this architecture of psychological manipulation and priestly extortion inevitably collides with historical reality when the text applies its analytical framework to the genesis of Western civilization's most dominant religion.
And the historical deconstruction presented here is deeply provocative because it completely surgically severs the biological founder of Christianity from the intellectual architect of the Christian church.
The book views the historical Jesus almost entirely through the lens of a Buddhist figure, doesn't it?
It does. It describes his original teaching not as a complex theology of sin and redemption, but simply as a practice of life. He preached an inner kingdom of heaven that is already present, a psychological state of the heart achievable in the immediate moment.
He taught absolute non-resistance, the complete eradication of anger, and the total irrelevance of atonement.
Yes, the text emphasizes that his fundamental standpoint was essentially that sin is of no account. By removing the concept of sin, he was actively, deliberately dismantling the entire power structure of the Jewish priestly hierarchy.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Then the text introduces the Apostle Paul. And the book portrays Paul not as a faithful messenger, but as a deeply decadent figure driven by a profound, consuming psychological resentment.
Paul takes this peaceful, immediate practice of life and executes a complete, catastrophic inversion of it.
Was Paul essentially a rogue franchise manager who took the founder's peaceful recipe and laced it with poison to sell it to an angry, resentful mob?
That is a phenomenal way to describe it. Imagine a visionary founder who opens a beautiful, egalitarian community kitchen where the food is free, the doors are always open, and there's absolutely no judgment of who sits at the table.
Okay, I'm with you.
Then the founder tragically dies, and this rogue manager illegally assumes control of the franchise. He immediately changes the locks. He institutes an impossible punitive dress code. He begins charging extortionate spiritual prices for entry.
And most importantly, he laces the founder's originally nourishing recipe with a highly addictive, toxic poison designed specifically to sell it to an angry, resentful mob.
All while cynically keeping the gentle founder's face plastered on the corporate logo. It is Paul, according to the text, who invents the brutal doctrines of a bloody sacrifice on the cross, the supernatural resurrection, and the terrifying concept of eternal judgment.
He engineers this theology entirely to appeal to the pagan masses of the Roman Empire and to construct a brand new, infinitely more powerful priestly structure upon the ashes of the old one.
Exactly. The deconstruction of Paul within the book illustrates precisely how a movement is violently hijacked by the exact psychological forces it originally sought to neutralize.
I mean, the text does not mince words. It explicitly labels Paul a pernicious blockhead who deliberately forged the counterfeit coins of real Christianity, right?
It does. The life of Jesus, as framed by this philosophy, was a practical, lived demonstration of how to exist entirely without resentment, without the psychological need to punish others, and without feeling bound to the suffocating concept of inherited guilt.
But Paul, according to the historical analysis provided, represented the ultimate Jewish flare of that eternal flame of resentment directed against the strong, the noble, and the healthy classes of the Roman Empire.
Paul possessed a shrewd, terrifying political instinct. He realized that to build a counterpower capable of overthrowing the ruling classes of Rome, he needed to rally the massive, unwashed underbelly of the empire.
The masses, the outcasts, the chronically sick, and what the text refers to as the biologically botched.
Exactly. And to capture this specific demographic, a peaceful practice of life was completely insufficient. He required a mystery cult that could directly compete with the blood-soaked pagan religions already dominating the Roman psyche.
Like the ecstatic cult of Dionysus or the martial, blood-baptized cult of Mithras.
Right. He needed a bloody phantasmagoria. He needed the shocking aesthetic of a god executed on a cross. The book argues that Paul brilliantly and maliciously weaponized the very concepts of love and pity.
Because in this philosophical framework, pity is not a virtue of empathy, is it?
No, pity is a dangerous physiological contagion. It multiplies suffering, it glorifies sickness, and it drains the vitality of the healthy by forcing them to kneel before the weak.
So Paul utilized this contagion to forge a fiercely nihilistic religion, a psychological weapon designed specifically to tear down the successful, the strong, and the intellectually independent.
The profound, tragic irony that the book forces you to confront is that the entire Christian church, with its endless judgments, its moral condemnations, its threats of eternal punishment, and its absolute obsessive focus on the disease of sin, was systematically built upon the exact, diametric opposite of the life its founder actually lived.
Wow. So if we trace the logical thread of this entire discussion, we have traveled from the messy, violently disorganized laboratory of cultural progress to the tragic psychological moment where the human species was so terrified by its own immense biological majesty that it amputated its greatness and gave it away to an invisible phantom.
And we have examined how history's shrewd institutions, driven by cold-blooded reflection, eagerly stepped into that massive power vacuum.
Right, utilizing the holy lie of sin and the unfalsifiable threat of the beyond to literally weaponize our own natural biology against it.
And we have seen how a peaceful, immediate practice of life was cynically hijacked, injected with the contagion of pity, and transformed to a religion of profound resentment.
A religion engineered entirely to exact revenge on the strong and to subjugate the natural world to the dictates of a fabricated moral hierarchy.
This exhaustive deconstruction inevitably corners you, the listener, into facing the final, inescapable implication of the book's underlying philosophy.
Which is,
If you follow this logic to its absolute terminus, if you accept the premise that all the sublimity, the overwhelming power, the radiant virtue, and the miraculous strength that humanity has ever attributed to the divine is, in strict reality, nothing more than the alienated, stolen property of humanity itself, what exactly happens when the cultural fever finally breaks?
what happens when the societal shivering stops, the illusions burn away, and we finally cease apologizing for our own brutal, magnificent nature?
Think about your own existence. If the omnipotent God you've been waiting for your entire life, the external authority you hoped would eventually swoop down and grant you the ultimate permission to be powerful, unapologetic, and free, has literally been your own suppressed, terrified biological potential all along. What is the very first thing you will do tomorrow morning when you finally decide to reach up and reclaim your stolen crown?
Imagine starting a movement based entirely on peaceful action, right? Only to have your followers realize that actual lived virtue is just, well, it's simply too exhausting.
Right, it is a massive burden.
Exactly. So what do? They pull off this, like, the greatest historical bait and switch of all time. They literally swap out doing good for simply feeling guilty.
Yeah.
I mean, the book argues that Christians have never actually lived the life their founder commanded. Instead, they invented this impudent fable of justification by faith.
Which is a pretty staggering accusation when you really think about
But
it.
it really is. And why did they do it? Simply because they lacked the courage and honestly the...
To really grasp the gravity of that claim, we have to look at the sharp contrast the book draws with Buddhism.
Oh, yeah, the comparison there is fascinating.
It points out that a Buddhist actually behaves differently from a non-Buddhist. There's a tangible, observable difference in their daily physical actions. You know, their diet, their engagement with the world.
It's physical. It's grounded in reality.
Exactly. Christians, meanwhile, behave exactly like the rest of the world, but they mask this conformity behind ceremonies and, like, internal states of the soul.
Wow.
It became a religion of internal psychology rather than external action. The outward behavior doesn't change, but the internal narrative about that behavior becomes endlessly complicated.
Endlessly complicated. Right, and that introduces this really fascinating concept from the book, Christian dilettantism. It's this idea where faith is used merely as an ass's bridge, essentially a shortcut or a crutch. You bypass the agonizing difficulty of actual lived virtue, and you just, believe really hard instead.
You just think your way into virtue.
Right. But how does a movement entirely based on a founder's specific behavioral teachings translate into a language that fundamentally alters its core? I mean, how does a doctrine originally aimed at the peace of the lambs morph into this deeply pessimistic worldview? A worldview where the mortal enemies are suddenly power, intellect, and the good cheer of classical Greek and Roman times.
Well, to understand that shift, we have to view history through a lens of biological and psychological necessity. This transformation wasn't just some clerical accident at a council meeting.
It wasn't just a typo in a manuscript.
No, not at all. It was a highly calculated adaptation to the religious masses of that specific era. I'm talking about the people who were previously following the subterranean cults of Isis and Mithras.
Right.
You have to remember the context of these masses within the Roman Empire. Existence was profoundly burdensome for them. They were the oppressed, the suffering, the slave.
Their daily lives were just brutal.
Absolutely brutal. Life was so fundamentally unendurable to them that they could only survive by turning absolutely away from themselves. They had to absorb themselves in an illusion, a promise of a beyond, because the reality of their present was just too heavy to bear.
So, if you are completely powerless in the physical world and you cannot perform grand works or win physical battles, you have to redefine virtue itself to suit your lack of power.
Precisely.
If you cannot win a physical war, you wage a spiritual war.
That is precisely the mechanism at play here. The weak wage war against the strong, but never through physical violence or direct confrontation.
Because they lose.
Instantly. They would instantly lose. So instead, they wage this war through ruses, spells, and lies. It's an underground psychological campaign to invert the very values of society. They practice what the book calls moral castration.
Moral castration, such a vivid phrase.
Because they cannot safely or successfully exercise natural, virile passions like pride, anger, dominance, or the will to conquer. They choose to amputate those passions entirely. They cut them out, and then claim that not having them is a virtue.
Wait, okay, I have to challenge this whole moral castration idea for a second. The book acts like taming these aggressive passions is a tragedy, but isn't suppressing violent dominant impulses like the only way a cooperative society survives?
That's a fair question.
Right. I mean, if everyone acted like these heathen Arabs or Corsicans the book praises for their hard, dangerous lives, wouldn't we just be living in a constant state of violent anarchy?
Well, it is a crucial distinction to make. The book is not advocating for mindless, chaotic violence. The critique is really about honesty, motive, and biological vitality.
Okay, how so?
It's the difference between a strong person choosing to be peaceful and a weak person who is physically incapable of violence, claiming they are peaceful out of moral superiority.
Oh, I see. So it's about capacity.
Exactly. By setting up the harmless, good-natured little sheep as the absolute highest human ideal, they systematically slander all robust manly virtues. To those robust types, life is a beautiful tragedy of danger and strength. But the weak cannot survive that tragedy.
No, they have to change the rules of the game.
Yes. They deploy very specific recipes to convince the strong that their strength is evil. They don't just tame the predator, they pull its teeth out and then praise the toothless tiger for eating porridge.
That's a great way to put it. And the book actually details the specific recipes for how this psychological war is fought, right?
It does.
First, you appropriate virtue for yourself, claiming your inability to act is actually a conscious moral choice. Second, you set up your own weak, harmless type as the absolute standard of the universe, and you project that standard into the sky and call it God. Then you declare that anyone who opposes your ideal is an enemy of God. And finally, you reframe all natural suffering as punishment, and you treat the natural physical world as a mere trial for a better anti-natural future.
It really is a masterclass in psychological survival.
No.
And it brings us to one of the most striking analogies presented in the book, the eunuch.
Oh, yes. This part was wild.
The psychological observation here is profound. The book points out that we aren't disgusted by the voice of the eunuch. In fact, despite the cruel and violent mutilation required to produce it, the voice has actually grown sweeter.
It's got this feminine, non-threatening ring to it.
Exactly. Harmlessness is soothing to the masses.
Yeah.
The robust, dangerous vitality of a fully integrated human being is terrifying to someone who is weak. So society demands you cut out your own aggression, your own pride.
And when you speak with that castrated, sweet, accommodating voice, they call you good.
Precisely. They call you good.
But, I mean, if someone is actively warring against their own instincts, systematically hushing up the natural utility of human drives day in and day out, that takes an immense physical toll.
Oh, massive toll.
At some point, the body just has to break down. And isn't that exactly where the book makes its most bizarre claim, that what we call morality and sin are actually just misinterpretations of biology and digestion?
Yes, this is where the analysis shifts from sociological to purely physiological. The bold claim is that the deeply religious actually lack a nervous system.
Lack a nervous system.
Not literally, of course, but meaning they completely and utterly misunderstand the signals of their own bodies. They have lost the capacity to read their biology correctly, so they filter every physical sensation through a lens of metaphysical guilt.
It's like when you skip lunch, drink 3 coffees, snap at your coworker, and then spend the whole night agonizing over what a terrible, sinful person you are.
That is exactly it.
When really, your biology is just crashing. You just needed a sandwich and a nap.
That is exactly the dynamic the book is talking about. When a person experiences physiological exhaustion, nervous fatigue, or even simple indigestion, they don't say, I am physically ill, or my body needs rest.
Right. They make it spiritual.
They interpret that bodily discomfort morally and say, I have sinned, or I have a guilty conscience. They take a purely physical effect and assign it a metaphysical cause.
Wow.
And conversely, when their body naturally recovers from this physical prostration, they interpret that sudden lightness and rush of energy, not as biological recovery, but as redemption, grace, or divine miracle.
That makes so much sense. And the book points out how the purely psychical treatments of the church, things like prayer, exorcism, or extreme fasting, are incredibly dangerous because they just alter the symptoms.
They don't cure anything.
No. People will willfully induce morbidity through the maceration of the flesh or sleep deprivation, just to provoke these morbid feelings of guilt. It creates this endless, I think the term the book uses is folie circulaire. This circular insanity.
The folie circulaire is a physiological feedback loop. You intentionally make yourself sick to feel sinful, and then you pray yourself into nervous exhaustion to feel saved.
It's completely backward.
You don't cure the underlying exhaustion, you actually exacerbate it by demanding more mental and emotional strain. This often induces states of epilepsy or mass hysteria, which the deeply religious then point to as evidence of the divine. It is a profound sickness of the will.
Which brings us to the metaphor of the hypnotized hen by the chalk line of sin.
A brilliant image.
The chalk line isn't a physical barrier at all. It's entirely imaginary. But the hen is paralyzed by it anyway. If guilt is just biology misread, the book implies that a criminal who stands by his deed without remorse is actually healthier than someone paralyzed by a guilty conscience.
The logic explicitly confirms this, yes. A criminal who refuses to malign his own deed, who faces the consequences with a gloomy seriousness and an unbroken spirit, is considered 100 times more valuable biologically and spiritually than a broken-spirited Christian.
That's a tough pill to swallow for modern society.
It is, but the book argues that pangs of conscience are not viewed as a sign of moral elevation, but as an obstacle to biological recovery. It's a symptom of decadence, an inability to process and move past an experience.
So the healthy response to one's own past actions, even the terrible ones, shouldn't be wallowing in guilt. The book suggests that a healthy person should actually laugh at their own remorse.
Yes.
They should view it as absurdly as a dog biting a stone. The stone has already been thrown, right? Biting it does nothing but break your teeth.
Exactly. To endlessly replay and regret an action is to war against the past, which is a battle you cannot win. It drains the vitality required for the present.
But if this sickness is so destructive internally, how on earth did it become the organizing principle of entire civilizations? I mean, having deconstructed the internal biology of sin, we have to look at how this internal sickness was weaponized externally.
And that brings us to the concept of the herd.
Right, the herd.
The externalization of these internal states is where the societal critique really takes shape. European morality is identified essentially as the instinct of the herd, and the defining characteristic of a herd is that it seeks the just milieu,
The exact average.
the safe middle ground. A herd is terrified of anything exceptional, whether that exception represents someone far above their level or far below it. Excellence is just as threatening as degeneracy.
It's the ultimate tall poppy syndrome. In modern terms, it's like an algorithm designed to push only the safest, most middle-of-the-road content to appease the widest demographic without offending anyone. The qualities the herd praises, peacefulness, modesty, obedience, pity, equality. The book argues these are not inherently good in some cosmic sense.
Not at all.
They are merely the preservative measures of weak, gregarious animals trying to protect themselves from the strong.
It is a brilliant, highly effective survival mechanism for the collective, but the argument is that its ultimate consequence is catastrophic for human evolution. Well, the concept of equality before God is highlighted as the most pernicious valuation of all because it actively thwarts natural selection. It forces the healthy, the strong, and the capable to sacrifice themselves for the botched and the degenerate.
So it drags everyone down to the lowest common denominator.
Exactly. It ensures the survival of the weak, but entirely at the expense of human elevation. When the herd protects every single member indiscriminately and demands the strongest lower themselves to the level of the weakest, the entire species stagnates.
Which leads directly into this severe critique of the supposedly noble idea of self-sacrifice. The logic presented here is fascinatingly cold, and it forces you to really evaluate your assumptions.
It really does.
It asks, why should my neighbor's welfare be of greater value to me, my own? And why should my neighbor value his welfare differently than I do?
A very rational question.
Right. The book calls this an insane idea meant to turn every individual into a slave, or a mere tool for the community. When you hear that moral imperative whispering to you to put others first, the book says that is simply the voice of the herd instinct speaking, trying to maintain its own collective security at your expense.
And we have to connect this to the broader picture painted regarding modern political and social systems. The text synthesizes this critique of religious herd morality with a critique of utilitarianism, socialism, and democracy.
Oh, this part is heavy.
It is. Now, whether you agree with this critique of democracy or not, it forces you to look at modern politics not as new, rational inventions, but as secular versions of that exact same herd mentality.
So they just stripped God out of the equation.
Exactly. Without a divine figurehead, society has just substituted the greatest happiness for the greatest number or the state. These movements are viewed as the will to power of the mediocre.
The will to power of the mediocre.
Yes. They are designed to break the spirit of the strongest and noblest natures by infecting them with self-contempt and demanding they bow to the average. The underlying mechanism is completely identical.
Okay, so if all of our current moral laws, both religious and secular, are just the self-preservation tactics of the herd, how does the book suggest we actually measure the value of human actions? Where do we go if we abandon the chalk line?
We start with a foundational premise declared in the text. There are no moral phenomena, but only a moral interpretation of phenomena.
Wow.
Life itself, at its very biological and cosmic root, is defined as the will to power. Therefore, an action in itself is completely, entirely devoid of inherent value.
So the action itself means nothing.
Nothing. We cannot judge an action by its origins, we cannot judge it by its results, and we certainly cannot judge it by the subjective feelings that accompany it, because, as we established, those feelings are often just misread biology.
Right. So the only question that actually matters, according to the book, is who performed it.
Exactly.
The exact same act can be a profound privilege for a noble soul and an absolute infamy for a weak one. It is the quality of the individual that lends value to the action, not the action that lends value to the individual. But to support this, the book completely attacks the concept of free will, which is a really tough pill to swallow.
The attack on free will is essential to the entire architecture of this philosophy. The argument is that free will was invented purely so that man could be held responsible.
So they could punish us.
Yes, thereby allowing moralists and priests the right to punish and to judge. We created this idea that we are the causa prima, the absolute first cause of our actions, operating in a vacuum of pure, uninfluenced choice.
But the book says that's a lie.
It's a theatrical illusion. The free will theory is essentially an attempt to artificially extract the action from the actor, to say that you could have chosen otherwise, and therefore you were guilty.
But acts are mostly dictated by circumstance. I mean, they are superficial or merely reflex movements performed in response to a stimulus long before the depths of our beings are even consulted. So if becoming is a huge ring, everything that forms a part of it is of equal value, eternal, and necessary. We have to stop trying to extract the action from the person. But here's where it gets complicated, and I have a critical pushback.
Let's hear it.
The book admits that we still require a great deal of morality just to be immoral in this subtle new way. It talks about self-control, discipline, hardness. If we still need discipline and hardness to be immoral, aren't we just swapping one rule book for another? Aren't we just creating a new set of rules?
That is the natural friction in this philosophy, but the stance is clarified carefully. The goal is not to eradicate rules entirely, but to recognize them for exactly what they are. Tools.
Tools, not absolute truths.
Exactly. They're biological and psychological instruments, not absolute divine decrees. The free spirits, the individuals who possess the strength to rise above the herd, need a fundamentally different valuation than the herd does.
Because the old morality just doesn't fit them.
For the herd, the old morality is useful. It keeps them tame and allows society to function. But the new task for the higher man is to see that what society currently calls immoral things like pride, conquest, self-reliance, and the unapologetic pursuit of power is, from the standpoint of human economy, absolutely superior and essential.
So immorality becomes a virtue.
Progress in the abundance of life inherently requires progress in immorality, because growth requires breaking the old restrictive boundaries that the herd relies on for safety.
So we are both the invalid, suffering from the sickness of 2,000 years of herd conditioning, but we are also the physiologist, trying to diagnose and cure ourselves. The illness we are trying to cure is morality itself. I want you to observe your own moments of uprightness and guilt today. When you feel a pang of conscience, are those feelings truly a divine compass? Or are they just your body's fatigue, an indigestion or nervous exhaustion, filtered through thousands of years of the herd's desperate survival tactics?
And that leads to the ultimate question posed by the text. It asks whether the highest degree of goodness itself actually presupposes a certain intellectual myopia and obtuseness. If excessive wisdom means seeing clearly through the illusions that make life bearable for the masses, and if morality is just a comfortable, necessary lie we tell ourselves to avoid the terrible, beautiful chaos of nature, if you could completely cure yourself of this illness called morality, would you actually want to?
If you look closely at the architecture of what we call virtue, you hit this incredibly jarring proposition right away in the book.
Yeah, right in the first few pages.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The claim is that the dominion of virtue is never, ever established by virtuous means. Like to actually make people virtuous, the architect of that morality has to use the exact opposite of virtue.
They have to rely on lies.
Lies, slander, and, Machiavellian political violence. So we are jumping straight into the core of the text today.
Yeah.
And the mission for you listening to this is to decode this really uncomfortable claim.
And it is deeply uncomfortable.
Right. The claim that everything society labels as moral or good was actually built on a foundation of hidden coercion.
It completely inverts the framework you and I are usually handed. I mean, the text drops us into this concept of the great politics of virtue.
Which sounds noble, but it's really not.
Not at all. It insists that anyone who wants a moral ideal to dominate has to totally renounce the hope of actually being virtuous themselves. The great moralist has to be a great actor.
It's a somatic dissimulation.
Right. It isn't just a character flaw in a leader, it's the fundamental requirement of the job.
Okay, let's unpack this with an analogy. Think about a city's police chief.
Okay.
This chief is celebrated by everyone as, spotless, incorruptible, the ultimate beacon of absolute peace.
The ideal public servant.
Exactly. For you, walking the streets at night, the crime rate appears to be 0. You feel perfectly safe.
But there's a catch.
A massive catch. To maintain that immaculate illusion, to enforce that perfect peace for you, the police chief is secretly running a brutal underground organized crime syndicate.
Oh, right.
They're extorting rivals, blackmailing politicians, eliminating enemies in the dark. They use ruthless violence to keep the chaos out of sight.
So the virtue of the city above ground is entirely dependent on the immorality of the chief below ground.
Precisely. The book argues that a moralist doing their job perfectly operates exactly like that police chief.
That analogy captures the structural hypocrisy perfectly. But to really understand the danger of what the book is proposing, we have to look at the psychological mechanics driving it.
The psychology of obstacles.
Yeah, the text isn't just exposing corrupt leaders, it's methodically stripping away the innocence of virtue itself. It reveals it as a highly calculated will to power. It's a barricade built entirely out of fear.
And we have to ask, who exactly is building that barricade?
The masses. The book refers to them as the mediocre, the botched, or the physiologically weakened.
And just to pause for a second, a quick reminder for you listening. As we navigate this text, we aren't endorsing these deeply provocative political or philosophical views.
Absolutely not. We are simply acting as your guides to understanding the raw, unvarnished arguments presented by the author.
Right. So returning to the mechanism itself, how do the weak stunt the growth of the strong?
By completely redefining language. They take their own survival tactics, passivity, inability to take revenge, fear.
And they rechristen them as universal virtues.
Exactly. Patience, forgiveness, goodness.
You might wonder how they actually pull this off. I mean, how do the weak overpower the strong without using physical force?
They do it with guilt.
Yes, they create a social framework where instinctual strength, aggression, and ambition are labeled as sins. If you possess natural power, you are taught from birth to be deeply ashamed of it.
You're convinced to voluntarily lock yourself in a psychological cage.
Precisely. The moralist creates a monopoly on psychological violence.
And once you understand how this virtue dominates through guilt and linguistic manipulation, the book naturally shifts your attention to the target of this domination.
The target isn't just rival political factions.
No, the target is reality itself, and reality is attacked through the creation of ideals.
The book launches this surgical, really unrelenting critique of the phrase, "thus it ought to be."
The heartbeat of all ethics.
Yeah. But the text argues that any desire for things to be fundamentally different than they actually are is an act of supreme arrogance.
Because it's a condemnation of the entire universe. Nothing is truly isolated.
Exactly. The smallest thing bears the largest on its back. If you criticize the smallest part of reality, if you say, this one thing ought to be different, you are inherently condemning the whole connected web of existence.
I want to add some nuance here, because for you or me, wanting to improve things feels like the entire engine of human progress. It sounds counterintuitive to attack the idea of improvement.
It's natural to want things to be better.
Right. But the text isn't arguing against pragmatic problem solving, like curing a disease or building a better bridge. It's attacking the concept of absolute, disconnected ideals that demand reality conform to an impossible standard.
It's like perpetually using heavy, artificial digital filters on a photograph of a human face.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
By constantly insisting on the filtered ideal, this flawless, poreless, mathematically perfect version of a face, you are inherently slandering, debasing, and impoverishing the actual real-world face.
You make the real face seem inadequate.
Right. When beauty is severed from reality and becomes beauty for beauty's sake, or goodness for goodness sake, the real world, with all its messiness and friction, starts to look hateful to you by comparison.
The digital filter analogy works perfectly for the aesthetic side. But to understand the real psychological damage, we have to look at the malice beneath that filter.
It's not just about making a photo look nice.
No, it's about a deep-seated hatred for the actual face.
Yeah.
The book describes these absolute ideals as the evil eye for reality. The idealist actively avoids self-knowledge.
They prefer the comfort of that artificial filter over the harsh truth of nature.
Exactly. And the text categorizes these ideals into 3 distinct types to show exactly how this hatred for reality evolves over time.
Let's walk through those 3 types because they map out a clear historical descent in human psychology.
First, you have the pagan ideal. This one is born from an overflowing abundance.
It's a supreme affirmation of life, right?
Yes, where the strong give of their excess. It's still rooted in reality, driven by vitality and physical power.
But eventually, society transitions to the anemic ideal.
Right. This happens when the world is viewed as paler, thinner, and more exhausting. Suddenly, spiritualization and the complete absence of sensuality are elevated as the highest goods.
The physical, brutal realities of life are avoided.
The ideal here is the sage or the angel, a being entirely detached from the dirt, blood, and reality of the earth.
The body is treated as a prison, and the physical world is treated as something dirty that you have to endure until you reach some spiritual realm.
And then you reach the third stage, which is where the book hits its most critical pitch.
The anti-natural ideal.
Yes. This is born from profound, inescapable suffering. The world is no longer just pale, it is perceived as fundamentally absurd, evil, and deceptive.
The ideal is projected into a sphere that is entirely anti-logical.
It is a state reached by those who are so biologically impoverished by suffering that they no longer bestow anything upon the world. They only take, and they actively desire to deny life entirely.
It is pure nihilism, an idealization of absolute non-entity.
So, if we accept this premise that these ideals fundamentally slander and attack reality, it forces you to ask a logical question.
What happens to the human being who perfectly embodies this anti-real filtered ideal? What does the ultimate good man actually look like under this system?
The text introduces this devastating concept of the hemiplegia of virtue.
Hemiplegia is a medical term, right, for the paralysis of one entire side of the body.
Exactly. To be considered a good man under this moral framework, a person is expected to systematically amputate half of their natural instincts.
They must completely eradicate their capacity to be an enemy.
To be angry, to possess a strong, self-asserting ego, or to insist upon revenge.
Which means they lose their balance entirely. Because the natural human being, the complete human being, has both positive and negative forces.
They know how to be truly good precisely because they have the capacity to be dangerous, but they choose to control it.
Right. The good man of the anti-natural ideal, however, is biologically half paralyzed. The book quotes a Latuka chieftain named Komoro, who observed European missionaries and said, "All good people are weak."
They are good because they are not strong enough to be evil.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Think about a declawed indoor cat.
Okay, a declawed cat.
We look at it sleeping on the sofa, and we call it peaceful, we call it good. We praise it for never scratching us.
But the cat hasn't made a profound moral choice for peace.
Exactly. It has simply been surgically stripped of its biological capacity to pose a threat. Its goodness is just an enforced impotence.
That's a vital distinction. We constantly confuse domestication with morality. We call the cat improved because it's safe for us to be around.
But biologically, it is a deteriorated, genetically compromised creature. It couldn't survive a single day in the real world.
And here is where the true danger lies. The book warns you that this domesticated creature, this good man, is far from harmless.
He eventually becomes a tyrant.
Mankind has a tendency to take a mere vital measure, a survival tactic suited for a very specific, weakened type of life, and transform it into a universal standard for all living things.
So the declawed cat demands that all wild tigers must amputate their claws, otherwise the tigers are declared evil.
Exactly. The good man takes his specific condition of weakness, his inability to fight or assert himself, and projects it as an absolute moral law.
He demands that everyone else amputate their strong instincts to make the world safe and comfortable for him.
What starts as a mere biological preservation tactic of the weak morphs into a tyrannical ideology. It aims to exclude, condemn, and eventually eradicate all other stronger forms of life.
But wait, let me push back on this because it paints an incredibly grim picture of human nature. If goodness is often just masked weakness, what is actually driving the supposedly noble actions we see every day?
You mean charity, pity, and altruism?
Yeah. If the book claims altruism is a lie, is the author seriously arguing you should just be a ruthless, selfish egoist? Because that sounds like a recipe for total societal collapse.
It's a completely fair question, and it requires us to look at how the text radically reframes the concept of the ego. The book is much more nuanced than just telling you to be fiercely selfish.
How so?
It actually claims that the subject, or the ego, this idea of a unified, rational pilot driving your mind, is a piece of fiction. It's an imagined synthesis. You are not a single, cohesive self.
You are a multiplicity of constantly warring drives and instincts.
Right, and because all instincts are inherently unintelligent, they don't think, they just act blindly to assert themselves. They don't operate for the calculated welfare of the whole ego.
Every instinct, when it is active, sacrifices strength and acts counter to other instincts.
Therefore, the text argues that both egoistic and unegoistic actions are equally innocent. They are equally driven by these blind biological forces.
So if intent or selflessness doesn't matter, what determines the value of an action?
What matters is the physiological value of the individual possessing these instincts.
The book divides this into two trajectories, doesn't it?
Yes. If an individual represents the ascending line of mankind, meaning they possess vitality, creativity, and strength, their self-assertion, their so-called egoism, has extraordinary value.
Because it represents the promise and elevation of the future.
But if they represent descending development, decay, or chronic sickening, their value is minimal and their actions only serve to drag the species downward.
Which brings us back to the psychological engine behind altruism and pity. The text takes a sledgehammer to these concepts.
It frames altruism not as a virtue, but as the hidden egoism and deep-seated resentment of the botched.
And pity. Pity is described not as empathy, but as a moral parasite. It's an infection that actually wastes feeling and injures health.
The mechanism of pity is fascinatingly destructive in this framework. When you feel pity, you aren't actually solving the root cause of the sufferer's problem.
Instead, pity takes the suffering of one person and duplicates it in you.
It multiplies the total amount of suffering in the world, draining the energy of the strong without actually curing the weak.
When you look at the cult of unselfishness, the book argues it is upheld by those who are fundamentally conscious of being bungled.
Their elevation of altruism is a psychological valuation that simply says, I am not worth much. It is a feeling of deep impotence.
So they deify obedience, slave life, poverty, and helpfulness, because those are the only traits they can manage.
Yes, the instinct of revenge and resentment is the true engine here. When certain religious figures or anarchists or socialists cry out with righteous indignation for justice or equal rights.
The book interprets this not as a noble pursuit of fairness, but as an act of disguised revenge.
Exactly.
Think about the last time you saw someone loudly demanding justice, in a way that seemed aggressively focused on tearing down someone more successful rather than lifting anyone up.
The text forces you to ask, are they actually being good or are they just broadcasting their own resentment?
It is the cry of those who feel biologically oppressed by their own inadequate culture and need someone to blame for their suffering.
They want to drag the strong down to their own level of mediocrity because it makes their own existence easier to endure. The social framework they build is designed to make strength itself feel like a crime.
This draws an incredibly sharp line between two concepts. The text insists we have disastrously confused for centuries taming and rearing.
If morality, pity, and egalitarian ideals are all mechanisms used by the weak to restrain the strong, then the moral improvement of mankind that we blindly celebrate is revealed to be nothing more than the taming of a wild beast.
Priests, politicians, and moral philosophers have always acted like animal tamers. They put man in an iron cage of errors.
Through the use of fear, guilt, and the conceptual red-hot iron of sin, they tame him.
But as we discussed with the declawed cat, taming a beast does not make it better, it deteriorates it. Think of taking a wild, robust wolf and over generations taming it into a helpless, genetically compromised lapdog.
We call it improved because it's safer for us to be around, but biologically it is a deteriorated, weaker creature.
It makes it sick, emaciated, and filled with a loathing for the natural impulses of life. The tamed man is less harmful, yes, but he is fundamentally a weaker, more fragile member of his species.
Rearing, on the other hand, is entirely different. Rearing would be like husbanding the strength of a magnificent racehorse.
You are taking existing power, existing vitality, and deliberately cultivating it to make the creature even stronger, faster, and more capable.
Morality, the book argues, has engaged exclusively in taming while deceitfully calling it rearing.
And this raises the most chilling warning in the entire text. If we continue on this path of relentless taming, of civilizing and softening humanity through this anemic moral ideal, what is the end result?
The book paints a picture of a world turned into a giant hospital.
A giant hospital where everybody must be everybody else's nurse.
You can see the architecture of this hospital forming in modern hyper-safety culture, where the highest virtue is simply avoiding risk, removing all sharp edges, and making sure no one is ever uncomfortable or offended.
It's a terrifyingly sterile vision of the future, a completely flat landscape. We might achieve the peace on Earth that has been so long desired, but the cost is absolute.
We will have completely eradicated great deeds, daring, danger, and the immense, boisterous passions that actually make life on Earth worth living.
By declaring that the only desirable man is the harmless, rectangular, highly predictable blockhead, we actively try to suppress the very forces of nature that drive humanity forward.
So where does this leave us? The text brings us to a profound, almost tragic paradox at the very end of its analysis.
For centuries, millennia even, we have vivisected our own consciences. We have been driven by a highly moral, deeply ingrained demand for absolute honesty, for objective truth at all costs.
We sacrificed everything to this moral demand for truth.
But it is precisely this relentless moral demand for truth that is now forcing us to turn our gaze onto morality itself. We have to be honest about where our values came from.
And when we look with that absolute, unblinking honesty, we are forced to recognize morality not as a divine law, not as a universal truth, but as a useful error.
A necessary lie that helped humanity survive a certain brutal phase of its development, but which has now become a fatal burden.
Our own moral honesty has destroyed our belief in morality. The very intellectual subtlety we gained through centuries of moral self-castigation has now made it impossible for us to believe in the moral framework.
The illusion of the spotless police chief has been completely shattered.
You are staring directly at the underground syndicate that actually runs the world. We have departed from the safe, swampy soil of our forebears.
We are in mid-sea, surrounded by untried possibilities. If the compass of good and evil is gone, dissolved by our own strict demand for truth, what happens when you set sail into that open sea? Are you prepared to navigate a world where the only guiding force, the only wind in your sails, is your own unvarnished will to power? So consider the absolute shock of this claim, right? The idea that the appearance of Greek philosophers, starting from Socrates onward, is not actually the pinnacle of human thought.
Right.
It's actually presented in the book as a profound symptom of decadence and, well, decay.
Yeah, it completely dismantles this foundational pillar of Western civilization. I mean, we are so deeply conditioned to view someone like Socrates as the dawn of pure rationality.
The ultimate hero of the intellect.
Exactly, the guy who brought logic to the masses. But the book forces us to abandon that reverence entirely. It demands that we look at the psychological and cultural landscape of ancient Greece just before he arrived on the scene.
Because before him, things were very different.
Oh, fundamentally different. Prior to Socrates, the noble Greek society found the display of reasons, the entire practice of dialectics, of arguing your point step by step, to be essentially indecent.
Wait, I need to stop and really look at that, because we base our entire modern educational system on the Socratic method, right?
They do, yeah.
So how does the text argue that asking questions and using logic is somehow a sign of decay? Like, if you were a noble in that older aristocratic culture, how did you operate if you didn't argue?
You commanded. You just possessed this natural, unstated authority. The book points out that in a healthy aristocratic culture, authority is a given. If you had to explain yourself, like if you had to lay out all your reasons like 5 fingers on a hand just to prove you were right.
You've already lost.
Precisely. It meant your authority was inherently weak. Honest things and honest people, the text argues, do not carry their reasons in their hands like that. To have to prove your worth through relentless debate was seen as a profound loss of dignity.
Okay, let me try to map this onto a modern situation so you, listening, can feel the sheer friction of this cultural shift. Imagine you are sitting in a boardroom,
Okay, a boardroom.
right? And you're dealing with someone who has zero natural charisma, no inherent leadership qualities, and they command no immediate respect from anyone at the table. But instead of inspiring the room naturally, they trap you. They use relentless, exhausting logic traps to just paralyze the conversation.
They ask question after question.
Yes, but not to elevate the discussion. They do it to back you into a semantic corner. They're using logic as a defensive weapon, a way to extort rights and concessions that they simply couldn't command naturally.
That is a perfect translation of the dynamic. The book builds a very precise psychological profile of this Socratic shift. In this framework, Socrates represents the mob getting the upper hand.
The mom.
Yeah, the dialectic, this relentless logical questioning, is basically the revenge of the oppressed. The author refers to it as the cold knife cut of the syllogism.
Hold on. The cold knife cut of the syllogism, that is a really striking phrase, but what does that actually mean in practice? Like, what is the syllogism cutting through?
Well, a syllogism is just a formal logical argument. If A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C. It's cold. It's mechanical. The knife cut is the way it severs a person's natural instinct and authority. The dialectic forces the opponent to rely on abstract reasoning rather than their deeply ingrained aristocratic instincts.
It levels the playing field in the worst way.
Exactly. But the analysis goes much deeper than just social dynamics or rhetorical tricks. The book identifies a specific, highly decadent formula that these philosophers introduced to the world, and it goes like this. Reason equals virtue equals happiness.
Reason equals virtue equals happiness. So if you're purely rational, you will be a good person, and therefore you will be happy. I mean, that sounds like a pretty standard philosophical goal. Why does the book call that a decadent formula?
Because we have to ask why they clung to this exact equation with such absolute desperation. The book argues it certainly wasn't out of an overflow of psychological health or, confidence.
What was it then?
Fear. The ancient philosophers were terrified of their own wild, anarchic instincts. They felt they were standing on the absolute brink of dissolution and excess. Their internal drives were at war, threatening to tear them apart. So they installed reason as a tyrant.
To keep themselves from perishing.
Yes, it was a desperate medical intervention. It was a survival mechanism for a decaying mind, not a noble, detached pursuit of enlightenment. They had to be rational because if they let their instincts take over for even a second, they would literally destroy themselves.
That reframes the entire foundation of philosophy, because if our mission here is to figure out whether our minds are built for truth or just for survival, well, this is a massive clue.
A huge one.
If reason is merely a survival tool invented by terrified minds trying to leash their own internal chaos, what does that mean for the ultimate goal of reason? Like, what happens to the pursuit of truth?
It requires a total reevaluation of what we consider to be objective reality. The book makes a radical assertion regarding this. It states that there is no single objective truth out there waiting to be discovered by the rational mind.
None at all.
None. Instead, what we universally call truth is simply the kind of error without which a certain species of living being cannot exist.
I'm struggling with that phrasing. The kind of error without which we cannot exist.
It's dense, I know.
Are we talking about abstract concepts, or is the book actually arguing that the physical floor we are sitting on right now isn't real? Because that sounds like we're drifting into some simulation theory, and my feet feel pretty firmly planted.
No, it is not arguing that the physical matter doesn't exist. It is arguing that your brain's understanding of the floor is heavily filtered and fundamentally falsified.
Okay, falsified how?
The book identifies the driving force behind our search for truth, not as a pure detached desire for knowledge, but as the will to power. We don't actually want to know reality in its infinite, fluctuating atomic chaos.
Because that would be terrifying.
It would be overwhelming and entirely useless to us. What we want is to schematize reality. We want to impose a rigid regularity upon the chaos of becoming so that we can calculate, predict, and ultimately control our environment.
So we don't actually see the world. We see a highly edited summary of the world that allows us to walk through a room without tripping over a chair.
Exactly.
I think I see where this is going. Is it similar to looking at a subway map in a massive metropolis?
Oh, how do you mean? Let's unpack that.
Well, if you look closely at a subway map, say the London Underground or the New York subway, it is completely geographically inaccurate.
Oh, right. Completely.
The lines are drawn at these perfect right angles, the bright colors are very distinct, the distances between stations are totally warped, and the complex curves and deep elevations of the actual subterranean tunnels are entirely ignored.
They're smoothed out.
Right. It is, by definition, a massive error. It does not reflect the reality of the Earth beneath the city. But if that map were perfectly true to the chaotic, muddy, labyrinthine reality of the bedrock and the winding tunnels, you just couldn't use it to navigate.
You'd be paralyzed.
You'd be hopelessly lost trying to read it. We absolutely need the simplified, falsified air, those bright, straight lines, just to survive and function in the city.
That captures the exact mechanism perfectly. The map is an error, but it is a life-preserving error. The physical world exists, but our conceptual grasp of it is highly filtered to serve our biological needs.
But where does the danger come in?
The danger, according to the book, arises when we forget that it's just a map, the belief that absolute objective truth exists, and more dangerously, the belief that it has been found is actually fatal to the human intellect.
Fatal in what way? I mean, if you think you have the perfect map, shouldn't you feel secure?
That feeling of security is precisely the problem. It brings what the text calls a false spiritual peace. When you believe you possess the ultimate truth, it paralyzes the will to investigate further.
It makes you intellectually lazy.
Exactly. It stops you from questioning, from gathering new experiences, from adapting to new chaos. It is the end of intellectual growth.
And reading through the text, it seems this critique doesn't just stop at logical or scientific truth. It applies this exact same scalpel to moral truth.
Yes, very aggressively. The text explicitly equates goodwill, noble feelings, and traditional morality to narcotics.
Narcotics, like drugs.
Like literal drugs.
Yeah.
Physiologically speaking, these fine feelings soothe us. They provide immense comfort and alleviate the terror of living in a chaotic, indifferent universe where things happen without cosmic reason.
So morality acts like a painkiller.
Right.
It numbs the existential dread.
Exactly. But like any strong opiate, there is a severe physiological cost. These moral narcotics eventually weaken the nervous system.
Really. It frames it as a physical weakening.
Yes, they create physiological illusions that make us feel morally safe and spiritually superior. We start to believe the universe rewards good and punishes evil, which detaches us from the harsh, vital, uncompromising demands of reality. Mankind has paid an incredibly heavy price for these comforting errors.
We traded our vitality for comfort.
We traded our ability to face chaos for a warm, numbing blanket of moral certainty.
This is a devastating progression. I mean, if the outer world we perceive, the fixed objects, the rules of cause and effect, the moral laws we desperately cling to, is just a useful, schematized illusion, the book then turns its focus inward.
It does.
And I found this to be the most unsettling part of the entire text, the deconstruction of our inner world.
It is deeply unsettling because the internal landscape is the one place we feel uniquely certain about. Since the dawn of modern philosophy, there has been an unquestioned assumption that our inner consciousness is an undeniable foundational fact.
The classic formulation of this is Descartes.
Yeah.
Right? I think, therefore I am.
Right.
It feels absolutely bulletproof. Like, I can doubt that the table in front of me is real. I can doubt that other people exist. But I cannot doubt that I am currently having a thought. There has to be an I doing the doubting. How does the book possibly dismantle that?
Well, it calls the ego, or the subject, a mere grammatical habit.
A grammatical habit. You mean it's just a trick of language?
Precisely. Because our language structurally requires a noun for every verb, we blindly assume there must be a doer behind every deed. When lightning flashes, language makes us say the lightning flashes, as if there is a subject called lightning performing an action called flashing.
But the flash is the lightning.
Exactly. There is no separate doer. In the exact same way, we assume that when there's a thought, there must be a static, immortal I that is actively producing it. The book argues that the thought comes, and only afterward do we grammatically assign an I to take ownership of it.
I'm really struggling to separate the thought from the thinker. It feels so intuitive that my conscious mind is generating these ideas. How does the text prove that the I is added after the fact?
The deconstruction relies on a crucial, highly detailed concept, the chronological inversion of cause and effect. This is the mechanism that proves how out of touch our conscious mind really is.
Okay, break that down for me.
We naturally believe that we experience a motive in our mind and then we act physically. We believe a conscious thought causes the next thought, or a conscious feeling causes a physical reaction. But the book meticulously breaks down how our inner experience is actually chronologically backward.
Backward, meaning the physical reaction happens before the thought.
Yes. The actual physiological event happens first, completely below the threshold of consciousness. Your nervous system reacts to a stimulus. Then, milliseconds later, the sensation reaches your conscious mind.
Okay.
But the conscious mind hates a vacuum of meaning. It cannot tolerate an unexplained sensation. So it instantly invents a narrative, a motive, to explain why the physical sensation is happening. It inverts the timeline to make itself feel like it is in control.
Let me try to translate this chronological inversion into a physical scenario so we can, really visualize the mechanics of it.
Yeah.
Let's say you are walking down a dimly lit street late at night.
A classic scenario.
Right. Suddenly, you feel an inexplicable sense of dread. Your heart rate spikes, your palms start sweating, adrenaline just floods your system. Your conscious brain furiously scans the environment, sees a long, dark shadow stretching out from an alleyway, and immediately tells you, "I'm afraid because of that shadow." Is the text saying that narrative is a lie?
It is saying the narrative is a post hoc rationalization. The physiological feeling of dread happened first. It was likely triggered by invisible sensory inputs, a subtle shift in the air, a microscopic sound of footsteps, or even an internal shift in your own chemistry.
So the body knew before the brain did.
Exactly. The nervous system reacted instantaneously to protect you. The conscious brain, arriving late to the scene, merely invented a plausible cause, the shadow after the fact, to make sense of the physical sensation.
So the brain is just a storytelling machine trying to take credit for what the body has already done.
If we connect this to the broader philosophical picture, it means that everything that actually reaches our consciousness is a final phenomenon. It is a conclusion, not a cause. Our conscious thoughts do not cause our next thoughts. Our feelings of pleasure and pain do not cause our physical reactions. They are merely attendant phenomena, riding alongside the physiological reaction that is already well underway.
We are just entirely blind to it.
Completely, entirely blind to the actual lightning-fast interactions taking place within our nervous system. The conscious mind is not the coach calling the plays. It is just a late-arriving spectator sitting in the bleachers, drafting a fictional narrative to explain a game that was already played in the dark.
I have to pause here because the implications are just staggering. If the I, the immortal soul, and the conscious ego are all fictions invented after the fact by a blind grammatical habit,
Right.
well, what is actually in charge?
Right.
If I am not the captain of my own ship, who or what is steering?
The book proposes a radical, grounded shift in how we view existence. We must make the body, not the mind or the soul, the absolute starting point of our understanding. The body is the rich, distinct, tangible reality.
And the soul.
The soul, by contrast, is an ancient, unscientific superstition derived from observing the agonies and mysteries of the physical form. But crucially, the text does not view the body as a single, monolithic piece of meat.
This is where the terminology gets really fascinating. The book introduces this concept that the body is a vast, complex community. It describes it using the phrase, an aristocracy of cells.
It is a dynamic plurality. The subject we refer to when we casually say I is actually a multitude of competing, cooperating regions.
It's a hierarchy.
A strict biological hierarchy where different living entities, drives, and instincts within us are constantly coming into being, struggling for dominance, commanding beneath the surface, and obeying.
Let's use an analogy to really solidify this power dynamic. Let's think of this biological hierarchy like a massive multinational corporation.
Okay, I like that.
Your conscious mind, that persistent, serene feeling of I, is just the CEO sitting in a quiet, soundproof corner office on the top floor of a skyscraper.
Completely isolated.
Completely. The CEO takes all the credit for the company's movements, signing the papers, giving the grand speeches, and truly believing they are directing every single detail. But the real grinding work is being done by millions of invisible workers.
Yeah.
Your individual cells, your base instincts, your autonomous nervous system.
And those workers are not passive.
Exactly. They're not passive at all. They are down in the factories and the supply chains, fighting fiercely for resources, cooperating out of sheer biological necessity, and commanding each other in the dark.
Yeah.
And here's the brilliant, slightly terrifying part of the analogy. The CEO is deliberately kept in ignorance. The CEO is not told about the day-to-day disturbances, the minor union strikes, the internal wars for nutrients. They're only fed highly simplified, heavily redacted reports, just enough to maintain the illusion of control.
Because if they knew everything,
Right, for the conscious mind knew everything the body was doing every single second, the digestion, the cellular repair, the immune responses, it would be utterly paralyzed by the sheer volume of chaotic data.
this raises a profound question, and it shifts our entire perspective on what it means to be alive. Life, according to the book, is not about a pure soul seeking abstract truth or moral perfection.
It's much more visceral.
It is fundamentally about this plurality of forces within us striving for greater strength. Every single cell, every deep-seated instinct is exercising its own will to power. It wants to expand its sphere of influence, and it assimilates the outer world, whether through physically digesting food or conceptually digesting ideas, to maintain and grow this internal biological hierarchy.
So we are not one thing.
No, we are not a single serene spirit looking out at a static world. We are a complex, ancient battlefield of forces that have temporarily agreed to work together under the banner of a fictional I.
It leaves you looking at your own hands, your own thoughts, with a deep sense of suspicion. Imagine sitting with this concept for a moment. If every single thing you know, from the physical stars in the night sky to the moral laws you hold dear, right down to the very concept of the I that is listening to these words right now, is merely a simplified, heavily redacted, fictional interpretation.
A necessary error.
Exactly. An interpretation crafted by an invisible aristocracy of cells just to keep your biological form alive. Then who exactly are you?
If our very consciousness is nothing more than a late-evolving superficial tool designed purely to manage our biological needs, then at this point we must consider what happens when these exact same blind, self-serving instincts begin to construct our grand moral laws and our societal values.
Right.
Following this, if you are sitting there right now, assuming that your memory acts like, a passive tape recorder quietly playing back the past, you are already falling for a really profound biological lie.
You really are. It is deeply unsettling when you begin to strip away that mystical pedestal we usually put human awareness on.
Right, because we have this deeply ingrained habit of placing consciousness at the absolute core of our being.
Exactly. As if it is the truest, most essential part of us, or some sort of eternal soul existing outside of time, just objectively observing things.
But the book argues that memory, and really consciousness itself, is not an archive at all. It is an aggressive biological weapon.
It really is. The book meticulously breaks down why consciousness is actually a highly superficial tool. In fact, it sits at the point that is the remotest from the biological center of the individual.
Which is so counterintuitive.
Right. It was not developed to uncover some grand, objective truth about the universe.
Yeah.
It was developed strictly out of necessity.
Like an evolutionary necessity.
Yes, specifically for communication, coordination, and survival among a really vulnerable species. To truly understand the mechanics of this, we have to look very closely at the amoeba metaphor that the book details.
Oh, right, the amoeba.
Yeah, so picture a microscopic amoeba interacting with its environment. It does not possess a detached, objective lens to view the world.
It just reacts.
Exactly.
Yeah.
When it encounters foreign matter, its protoplasm mechanically extends, engulfs, and assimilates that chaotic external material.
It breaks the matter down and digests it.
Yes, and quite literally makes it equal to itself. And the book argues that human minds are engaged in exactly this same violent mechanical process with information.
Because we are constantly bombarded by just chaotic, overwhelming sensory data all the time.
Right. And our memory and our consciousness, they do not record this chaos accurately. Instead, they forcefully make it equal to our past experiences.
So that we can actually digest it.
Yeah, digest it, categorize it, and essentially just survive the sheer overwhelming nature of reality.
There is a quiet terror to that if you apply it to how you experience your daily life. So consciousness is essentially just a filter for survival.
That is exactly what it is.
It is like a motion sensor light attached to the front of a house. That sensor does not care about the direction of the wind, right?
No, not at all.
It does not care about the ambient temperature, and it does not care about the phases of the moon. It only perceives when a human walks by.
Because that is the specific parameter it was engineered to care about.
Right. According to the book, our consciousness operates exactly like that motion sensor. We ignore the vast chaotic majority of reality, and we only perceive what is biologically useful to us.
We are totally blind to everything else. And the book actually takes the implications of that filter even further.
How so?
It argues that there can be no doubt that all our sense perceptions are entirely permeated by valuations.
Hmm.
We do not look out and see a neutral, objective world.
We see a world graded by biological utility.
Precisely. Every particular color you perceive, for example, is not just a neutral wavelength of light hitting your retina. Besides being a color, it expresses a specific value to us.
Like whether it is pleasant or painful?
Right, based entirely on human evolutionary needs.
Yeah.
But we seldom admit this to ourselves. Or, we only realize it in really extreme conditions.
The book brings up the example of convicts, doesn't it?
Yes, convicts confined in a jail for a long time, or lunatics. Their severe sensory deprivation strips away their intellectual distractions.
Making them hyper-aware of the profound emotional and biological weight of just a simple color.
Exactly. Or consider how insects operate in the world. Ants instinctively react in entirely different ways to different shades of color.
Oh, wow, right.
One specific shade might trigger an immediate survival or defense mechanism, while another shade triggers a foraging instinct. They do not perceive the truth of the light.
They perceive its biological utility.
Yes. And the uncomfortable realization the book forces upon us is that human consciousness is doing the exact same thing. It is just masked by layers of intellectual sophistication.
So if our basic perceptions are merely these biological motion sensors, programmed strictly to keep us alive rather than to show us reality, then the entire mental framework we construct on top of those senses must be equally compromised.
It has to be.
I am thinking specifically about logic here. I mean, we pride ourselves on our logical reasoning. It is the foundation of mathematics, architecture, entire societal systems.
Absolutely.
But if our senses are fundamentally deceiving us for the sake of survival, our logic must be built on that exact same falsification.
The book argues precisely that point. The whole apparatus of human knowledge is an abstracting and simplifying apparatus.
It is not directed at knowing things in any pure, objective sense, is it?
No, not at all. It is directed entirely at the appropriation of things. Logic was actually born out of the gregarious instinct.
The evolutionary need for early humans to achieve mutual understanding and governance.
Right. For a primitive society to function, people needed to agree on basic concepts. They needed to agree on what constituted a predator or what constituted food.
But to reach that vital agreement, a massive intellectual compromise had to happen.
Yes, a huge one. The book dives deeply into the concept of identical cases, which is really the cornerstone of all logic.
Because all of logic, and indeed all of mathematics, relies on the basic equation that A equals A.
Exactly. But the book points out a devastating biological reality here. Before one can conclude anything logically, a fundamental falsification of all phenomena must occur.
We have to pretend that identical cases exist.
Right, even though in nature, nothing is exactly identical. No two leaves on a tree are the same.
No two moments in time are identical.
And no two experiences are ever truly the same. Every single thing in the universe is utterly unique and constantly changing.
It is as if we are trying to do math with clouds.
That is a great way to put it.
No two clouds in the sky share the exact same shape, the same density, or hold the exact same amount of moisture. But if you want to count them, if you want to apply logic to them, you have to artificially freeze them in your mind.
You do. You have to violently strip away all their unique, shifting, vaporous qualities.
And just pretend they are identical solid units, just so you can say, there are two clouds.
We are essentially hallucinating identical cases just to make the world calculable.
But this raises an incredibly difficult question. If logic requires this fundamental falsification, if it relies on us lying to ourselves about the existence of identical cases just to survive, then what is truth?
It completely upends the concept, doesn't it?
Yeah, how does the book define truth if the very tool we use to find it is a biological lie?
Well, the book offers a definition of truth that completely inverts our usual understanding. It states that truth is not the opposite of error.
Wait, really? Because we are deeply conditioned to think of truth and error as a strict binary.
We are, but the book argues that truth is merely the relation of different errors to each other.
That is fascinating. So truth is simply the specific error that has proven most useful for the preservation of the species.
Exactly. Over millennia, organic creatures developed certain foundational errors, like the belief in identical cases or the belief in stable, unchanging objects.
And those creatures who embraced these comforting errors survived.
Right, while those who perceived the chaotic, ever-changing reality as it actually is were paralyzed by the complexity and likely perished.
Therefore, the intellect marks as true whatever gives it the greatest feeling of power, security, and resistance against the chaos of existence.
Yes, truth is not an objective reality waiting to be discovered. It is just an ancient, deeply ingrained, highly effective biological lie.
Wait, I need to push back on the mechanics of that, because if our logic is just a survival tool and our truth is merely a useful error, then the way we understand interaction in the universe must also be a fabrication.
You mean cause and effect?
Yes, causality. But that contradicts every waking moment of human experience. If I push a glass off a desk and it shatters on the floor, I caused that. It is not an illusion, it is a physical reality.
I see why you would say that.
How can the book claim that causality itself is just another psychological comfort?
Well, think carefully about where you actually derive the concept of a cause in that scenario. You observe the glass falling, and you observe the glass shattering.
Right.
But you do not actually observe the invisible mechanism of causality in nature. The book explains that we derive the concept of cause strictly from our own subjective feeling of muscular power and intention.
Oh, I see. When you push the glass, you feel an internal tension.
Yes, a microsensation of muscular contraction and intention. You sequence these internal feelings and categorize yourself as the cause of the movement.
And then, out of a profound psychological need, you project this internal biological framework onto the entire external universe.
Exactly. You look for a doer behind every deed. When the wind blows or a tree falls or a star collapses, human beings instinctively try to discover the agent behind the phenomenon.
Even when there is none. We invented thingness based on our own internal sensations, and we constantly read it into the chaotic pell-mell of sensations around us.
We do.
This is where that linguistic observation from the book becomes so critical to understanding the depth of the illusion.
Ah, yes, the grammar aspect.
The book points out our ingrained grammatical habit of saying lightning flashes. In our grammar, we artificially invent a subject, the lightning, and an action, the flashing.
But the lightning is the flash.
Exactly. There is no hidden entity behind the light orchestrating the event, yet our brains are so deeply wired to see causes and subjects that we literally split a single unified phenomenon into a doer and a deed.
Exactly. And the book explains that causality is entirely useless as an objective concept. A phenomenon is neither affected nor is it capable of affecting.
There is no invisible string tying event A to event B.
No, there is only a continuous, incredibly complex flow of power relations and transformations. What we call the instinct of causality is really just our profound fear of the unfamiliar.
So when we encounter a chaotic new event in this flow of power relations, we feel deeply insecure and aghast.
Yes, our desperate attempt to find a cause is simply an attempt to find something recognizable in that chaos to pacify our anxiety.
As soon as we can point to a cause, even a completely fabricated one, we feel safe.
Exactly. The search for causality is not a search for objective truth. It is a desperate search for the familiar.
If there are no causes and no subjects orchestrating actions, well, if there is only this terrifying continuous flow of power relations, then that completely destroys the oldest philosophical comfort blanket we have.
It really does.
I am talking about the separation between the apparent world and the real world. If you have ever studied Kant, you know this as the thing in itself.
Right, the deeply held idea that there is the flawed, messy, chaotic world we perceive with our senses, and then there is a pure, unobservable, real world hiding behind it.
The book's dismantling of that concept is absolute, isn't it?
It is. It argues that the thing in itself is pure nonsense. We have this dogmatic idea that things possess a nature in themselves, quite apart from our biological interpretation of them.
But the book states that a thing is merely the sum of its effects on other things.
Yes. If you were to imagine all other things could be non-existent, a thing has no qualities whatsoever, and a thing without qualities does not exist.
The concept of thingness was only invented fancifully by us to meet certain logical needs.
To correlate a multitude of relations and activities into a manageable package so our minds wouldn't be overwhelmed.
So if you take an apple and you systematically subtract all of its relationships, how it reflects light to your eye, how it resists the touch of your hand, how its mass interacts with gravity, how it chemically interacts with the air around it.
There's no secret hidden apple left behind in some ethereal realm.
The qualities are the thing. There is no thing in itself. But if that is true, why have so many brilliant philosophers spent centuries insisting that a real world exists behind the scenes?
Why work so hard to maintain that illusion?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, it comes down to the psychology of the philosophers themselves. The book elaborates that the real world is a fiction born of profound psychological fatigue.
Fatigue.
Yes. Philosophers, moralists, and religious thinkers, like Plato and later Kant, could not endure the overwhelming chaos, the relentless suffering, and the constant merciless change of reality.
The book refers to this actual reality as becoming, right?
Yes, becoming a world of constant flux and impermanence. Because they were mentally and spiritually exhausted by the struggle of becoming, they invented a static, peaceful, unchangeable, true world.
Which they call being.
Exactly. It was a psychological emergency measure.
Yeah.
They desperately needed a world where reason, logic, and morality were absolute because the physical world offered none of those comforts.
It is an intellectual escape hatch. When the chaos of the physical universe becomes too much to bear, you just invent a secondary, perfect universe where all the suffering makes sense.
It is the ultimate escape hatch. But the book reveals the dark thematic synthesis behind it. It explains that the creation of this true world of being is actually an act of deep resentment against life.
By valuing a fake, unchangeable spiritual world, humanity systematically slandered the only world that actually exists.
Our physical world of change, contradiction, deception, and struggle, they called the real world the world of appearance and deemed it immoral simply because it causes suffering.
So the invention of the real world was an act of revenge by the spiritually weak against the chaotic nature of reality. They could not master the chaos, so they declared it false.
That's exactly it.
If you are listening to this and looking around your room, you have to realize the gravity of what the book is suggesting. Every object you see, every cause and effect you think is happening, the entire framework of logic you use to make decisions.
It is all just your brain aggressively trying to keep you safe from chaos.
We built our entire intellectual and moral foundation on a comforting lie. We invented consciousness to survive, logic to coordinate, causality to soothe our anxiety, and a real world to escape our suffering.
Yes, we did.
But what happens when a society or an individual finally realizes that this real world was a fabrication all along? What happens when the escape hatch is permanently locked?
That realization is what the book defines as nihilism.
Nihilism.
Yes, the nihilist is the person who realizes that the world, as it ought to be, the peaceful, moral, static world of being, does not exist.
And because they have been taught for centuries that only that imaginary world had value, they look at the real world of becoming and conclude that existence has no meaning whatsoever.
They feel the heavy pathos of the in vain. Everything seems pointless. However, the book calmly points out that this objective, passive despair is actually just another sign of weakness.
It is an inability to create meaning without relying on the old, comfortable illusions that previous generations used as crutches. And right now, we are watching science act as the great catalyst for this nihilism. Science is systematically dismantling all these old moral and religious illusions, stripping away the true world, which the book acknowledges is a necessary step.
It is.
But science isn't offering a replacement for meaning, it is just leaving us with the void.
That is because science itself is just another method of interpreting the world to make it manageable, not an ultimate explanation of reality.
Oh, because it operates on the exact same biological constraint as logic.
Yes.
Yeah.
It attempts to master nature by reducing infinite, unique qualities into measurable quantities. It is still a system of categorization born from the intellect's repugnance to chaos.
It is highly effective for governance and utility, but it does not provide absolute truth, because absolute truth does not exist.
Exactly. Science transforms nature into concepts strictly to govern it.
So where does that leave us?
Well, the ultimate realization, the most profound insight the book offers, is that the world is entirely in flux. It is a great revolving lie, continually moving onwards, with no inherent purpose, no final goal, and no hidden reality waiting to be discovered behind the curtain.
Just chaos.
Yes, but to look clearly at this terrifying, meaningless chaos, to fully accept the relentless suffering and contradiction of becoming, and yet, out of your own overflowing strength, to impose the character of being upon that chaos through your own creative will, that is the highest possible expression of the will to power. Which really just reveals the absolute arrogance of modern physics. I mean, when you think about it.
Yeah.
You look at the mechanical interpretation of the world, and it just stands there triumphant, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It really does.
You are taught from a very young age that science has this clean conscience because it relies on these supposedly objective mechanical procedures. But the argument laid out here in the book rips this apart immediately.
Right. It's a profound epistemological blind spot.
Yeah, exactly. The premise is that all these foundational concepts we blindly rely on, things like, energy, push, pull, and the laws of nature, they actually only describe what is happening in the universe. They are completely, utterly silent on why it happens.
And then by an epistemological blind spot, it's a flaw in how we even acquire knowledge in the first place. We assume we are discovering objective truth.
Right.
But what we consider objective reality is actually a highly subjective interpretation. It is driven by a very deep psychological need.
A need for control, basically.
Precisely. Take the concept of the atom, or the idea of constant causes. The book argues that these are purely psychological fictions. Think about it. You look out at a universe of terrifying, unceasing chaos.
Just constant, unpredictable flux.
Yes, everything is in flux, and your human mind simply cannot tolerate that level of unpredictability. It's terrifying.
Yeah.
You have a desperate biological need to make the world calculable, to make it predictable so you can navigate it safely.
Because if the universe is just chaotic, unyielding flux, you'd go mad trying to process it every single second.
Exactly. So what do? You invent these constant causes. You invent the idea of an indivisible, unchanging atom. You tell yourself the universe is made of neat little building blocks.
So mechanics, in this view, isn't actually the language of the universe at all.
No, not at all. It is merely a sign language, a coping mechanism, really, for the results of forces we cannot actually comprehend. We mistake our psychological need for order as an actual law of the physical world.
Okay, let's unpack this, because it completely shatters how you and I are conditioned to look at reality.
It really does.
Imagine you are watching a game of billiards. One billiard ball rolls across the felt, strikes another, and that second ball shoots across the table into a pocket.
Sure.
We are taught that physics and the laws of motion commanded that reaction, right?
Right, that it's just math.
Yeah, we think the balls are obeying some cosmic traffic law dictated by mathematics. But the logic we are examining argues something entirely different. We're just translating a power struggle into the visual symbols of the human eye.
Yes.
The balls aren't obeying a law at all. What you're witnessing is one quantum of power simply imposing its will upon another.
And that distinction, that shift in perspective changes everything. The stronger force simply masters the weaker. There is no moralistic law being followed, only a raw, unyielding contest of dominance.
Just pure power.
Right. The book insists that there is nothing unalterable in chemistry or physics. The idea of the unalterable is just a school prejudice. When chemical elements react in a beaker, it is not obedience to a rule. It is a dynamic, instantaneous relationship of dominance. The missing ingredient in all of physics, according to this philosophy, is the will to power. Every movement, every force, every chemical reaction in the universe must be understood as an insatiable desire to manifest power.
So it's not a mathematical equation balancing itself, it's a war.
A constant, invisible war. The victorious force draws its ultimate consequence at every single moment. Things in the physical world are calculable not because they are obeying nature, but simply because a given force cannot be anything other than what it is.
It exerts its exact, precise degree of strength against whatever resists it.
Exactly. It has no choice but to manifest its power.
So if we follow this logic to its conclusion, it forces a massive shift in perspective. If gravity and chemistry aren't obeying mechanical laws, but are just endless expressions of power and dominance, what happens when we look at living things?
Right, we have to move from the atom to the cell.
Because biology is built on that very same chemistry. If the bedrock is just a power struggle, then biology must be fundamentally misunderstood by modern science. And this brings us to a direct, incredibly aggressive critique of Darwinism in the book.
It's a total dismantling of it.
The argument here is that self-preservation, which is, the absolute golden calf of evolutionary biology, is a teleological fiction.
Right, and we should clarify what a teleological fiction is for a second. It's a false assumption that nature has some grand, pre-planned goal or purpose. We look at an animal and assume its ultimate purpose is to survive.
Right, to just keep living.
But the book states that an organism does not primarily want to survive. Survival is not the goal. What it actually wants to do is discharge its strength.
And a total inversion of motive.
It is a radical dismantling of how you perceive life. The book asks you to look at a primitive protoplasm, A microscopic, single-celled organism extending its pseudopodia, its little microscopic tentacles.
Just sort of reaching out into its environment.
Exactly. Now, Darwinian biology would tell you it is acting out of hunger or a desire to maintain itself. It's reaching out to find food so it doesn't die.
Yeah, self-preservation.
The counter-argument here is no, it is not trying to preserve itself. It is actively seeking resistance. It is extending itself out into the void to find something to overpower, to subjugate, and to incorporate into its own sphere of power.
So the act of appropriation is just the primordial desire to overpower.
Yes. Survival is merely a secondary, almost accidental consequence of that successful expansion.
But wait, if I don't eat, I die. Isn't hunger, like literal painful hunger, the absolute prime mover? I mean, how can the book dismiss self-preservation when the drive to find nourishment seems like the most inescapable instinct of any living thing on Earth?
It's a crucial question, and the philosophy elegantly resolves that apparent contradiction. It explains that hunger is merely a secondary, later adaptation.
A later adaptation.
Yes. Hunger is what happens when the will to power can no longer dominate its surroundings and feels a profound lack. It is a specialized expression within a complex system of divided labor. The fundamental drive is always expansion, even if that expansion leads directly to the organism's own destruction.
Oh, I see.
Think of a creature that fights to the death over territory. It is prioritizing the discharge of its strength over its own safety.
It's expanding until it literally breaks.
Exactly. And this leads to a fascinating, almost disturbing reinterpretation of cellular division and procreation. In biology, we usually view procreation as the ultimate triumph of life, the spark of creation.
Right, the pinnacle of biological success.
But the argument presented here claims that cellular division is actually the result of weakness, not strength.
Wait, really? So a cell dividing to create new life isn't a sign of growth?
The complete opposite. When a cell absorbs too much matter from its environment, when it expands its power by subjugating other material, there comes a tipping point. If its internal power is insufficient to organize and subjugate that massive new amount of material, the opposing will within the mass forces a separation. It splits because it is impotent to maintain the whole.
Oh, wow. It simply cannot hold the empire together.
Therefore, the greater the tendency to split and divide, the more weakness is actually present in the original organism.
So, what does this all mean? If biological drives are essentially a form of internal imperialism, what does that make the human body?
It makes it a battlefield.
Yeah. The way you experience yourself sitting there right now listening to this has to be a completely misunderstood space. The book describes the human body not as a unified self, not as a single harmonious entity, but as an empire or an aristocracy of cells.
A brutal one at that.
There's a brutal ongoing division of labor happening inside you right now. The higher, more dominant types of cells are actively subjecting the lower cells to specific specialized functions. It's a literal biological caste system.
And within this biological empire, your consciousness, the part of you that thinks I am, the voice in your head, is actually a tiny, superficial, and incredibly fallible tool.
We give it way too much credit.
We really do. It is pure arrogance for humans to think that the conscious spirit or the soul is in charge of this vast, ancient bodily machinery. The animal functions, the unconscious processes, are 1,000,000 times more important than your conscious thoughts. In fact, consciousness is usually the exact place where the most profound errors are made.
I like to think of it like the CEO analogy. The human body is like a massive, ruthless, multinational corporation. Your conscious mind, your ego, isn't the boots on the ground making the hard decisions.
No, not at all.
You are just the figurehead CEO sitting in a quiet, soundproof glass office on the top floor. You receive these delayed, highly summarized memos, which you experience as feelings or thoughts. But the real brutal work of the empire, the digestion, the immune responses fighting off foreign invaders, the cellular wars, it's all done invisibly by the unconscious organs and instincts.
That's a great way to put it.
You sit in your glass office, and you feel a sensation of strength before you take an action. And you falsely deduce that your conscious will caused that action. You think, I decided to move my arm. But the argument here is that free will is a total illusion. The action was already prepared, negotiated, and decided by the machinery below.
The example of stumbling illustrates this chronological illusion perfectly. The book notes that when you trip over a rock, your foot reacts with a reflex. It shifts your weight to restore your equilibrium.
Right.
That complex physical reaction happens before you ever feel the pain in your brain. You do not react to the pain. The reflex happens first, initiated by the lower aristocracy of cells.
That is wild to think about.
The pain you eventually feel is just a delayed, localized message sent up to the CEO's desk, informing your consciousness that the whole organism's equilibrium was disturbed. The pain is just an intellectual judgment about the severity of a shock that the body has already dealt with.
And if you strip away the illusion of conscious control like that, you are forced to rethink how we view feeling good and feeling bad. The redefinition of pleasure and pain in the book is completely counterintuitive.
It turns everything upside down.
We treat them as opposites.
Yes.
We seek pleasure, we flee pain. But this philosophy argues they are not opposites at all. Pleasure is defined exclusively as the feeling of power overcoming an obstacle. Therefore, pain, which represents the obstacle, the resistance, is an essential, mandatory ingredient of pleasure.
Precisely. If there is no resistance, there is nothing to overcome. If there is nothing to overcome, there is no feeling of power, and therefore absolutely no pleasure.
It makes sense when you phrase it like that.
The text uses the sensation of tickling to prove this. Tickling is, at its core, a rhythmic sequence of small, painful stimuli. It's an irritation.
Yeah, it's not inherently a good feeling.
Right. But because these small hindrances are continuously, rapidly overcome by the body's nervous system, it creates an overflowing, almost unbearable sensation of pleasure and power. Pain is the necessary spur to the will to power.
So we actually need it.
Mankind does not seek happiness and avoid unhappiness, as utilitarianism would have you believe. Mankind seeks power, and therefore mankind must actively seek out the pain of resistance in order to feel that power manifesting.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. If we accept that the individual body is just an empire of warring cells where the weak are subjugated, that completely destroys how we view human society and evolution as a whole.
It scales up terribly.
Yeah, take that internal empire and scale it up to the entire species. The view presented here is a massive contradiction to the traditional theory of evolution. We are constantly taught that the species is progressing toward a higher state.
That things are always getting better.
Exactly. We believe that the fittest survive, and by surviving, they elevate the genetic pool. But the argument in the book is that the exact opposite is staring us in the face. The species is not progressing. The fittest, and by that the text means the most complex, the most brilliant, the highest types of humans, are actually the most fragile, and they are the very first to perish.
It is a profound, tragic inversion of how we view progress. Nature is remarkably cruel to its lucky exceptions. The logic is that the higher type of human represents an incomparably greater degree of internal complexity.
Right.
They have a multitude of competing drives and sophisticated mechanisms, but because they're so complex, because there are so many delicate moving parts, disintegration is 1,000 times more threatening to them. A minor disruption ruins the entire delicate system.
So who actually survives them?
It is the mediocre, the gregarious, and the herd-like humans. They survive through sheer numbers, through craftiness, and by playing it incredibly safe. They band together precisely because, individually, they are weak.
It's like comparing a highly tuned Formula One race car to a heavy, rusted cast iron tricycle.
Oh, I love that comparison.
The higher type of human is the Formula One car. It is sublimely engineered, incredibly fast, and capable of absolute brilliance on the track. But it is so fragile, so tightly wound, that a single piece of microscopic debris hitting the engine will shatter it into a million pieces.
Exactly.
And the mediocre human is the rusted tricycle. It's simple, it's incredibly slow, it's totally unexceptional, but it is nearly impossible to destroy. You can leave in the rain for a decade, you can drop it off a roof, and it still functions perfectly fine.
It just keeps rolling.
Right. And the text argues that domestication, which is what we politely call human culture and morality, does not elevate man. It is a degenerative process. It takes wild, powerful, unpredictable nature and grinds it down into something tame, predictable, and ultimately sick.
We constantly mistakenly judge the value of life by the metrics of happiness or mere survival. The argument here is that this is the fundamental, catastrophic error of modern biologists and sociologists.
They're measuring the wrong thing entirely.
They look at the survival of the tricycle and call it a victory, but mankind is merely experimental material. The goal of existence is not the preservation of the many. The herd, the masses, they are just the background noise, the base material.
Wow. That is so dismissive.
It is. The singular goal of nature is the creation of a few supremely powerful individuals. And it does not matter at all if these exceptional individuals are doomed to a brief, tragic existence because of their fragility. Their brief, blinding manifestation of supreme power is the true ascent of the will to power. The duration of their survival is totally irrelevant to their value.
If the exceptional are fragile and the mediocre survive entirely by banding together and playing it safe, then we have to look at the ultimate mechanism the herd uses to ensure its survival. We have to examine human society and the state.
Yes, the ultimate tool of the herd.
If you follow this philosophy, society isn't a noble pursuit of the common good. It is a weapon. The analysis of the state in the book is chilling. It defines the state as organized unmorality. It is a machine engineered specifically to do what the individual is too cowardly to do on their own.
It utilizes the division of labor to perfectly, seamlessly diffuse responsibility.
Right. Think about the implications of that for the society you live in. The entire machinery of the state, the police force, the penal code, the military apparatus functions precisely because no single person feels the crushing guilt of the violence being committed.
It's a diffusion of guilt.
Exactly. If a man wrongs the herd wants revenge. But the individual herdman is too weak and cowardly to execute that revenge himself. So they divide the task.
The legislator writes an abstract law.
And the police officer makes the arrest, simply following orders. A jury of 12 diffuses the blame so no single citizen bears the weight. The judge passes a sentence based on the legislator's text. The warden locks the cell door.
The responsibility is subdivided into absolute nothingness.
The site will commit acts of severity, exclusion, and institutional revenge that the individual would never have the stomach to execute personally. It forces you to look at your own participation in that machinery. It challenges you to question whether your adherence to laws, your polite behavior, and your display of civic morals is truly goodness, or if it is just the delegated cowardice described here.
The argument is that morality is simply a shield. It is a defensive posture invented by the weak specifically to restrain guilt and make sick those exceptional individuals who actually desire to exercise their power.
It's a mechanism to keep the Formula One cars driving at the speed of the tricycles.
Exactly. Even our most sacred, intimate institutions are completely dismantled by this logic. Look at marriage. The book brutally states that marriage has absolutely nothing to do with love. Love is an entirely separate, rare, and dangerous phenomenon.
So what is marriage then?
Bourgeois marriage is purely a utilitarian contract. It is granted by society to manage sexual desires while maintaining social order, lineage, and property. To actually found a lifelong institution on something as volatile and powerful as love would be completely impossible.
And this brings us to the ultimate necessary illusion of the herd. From the moment you are born, you are taught that justice and equality are the highest possible ideals. You are told that achieving a perfectly equal society will bring about universal peace and happiness.
But look at this through the lens of the will to power. We are taught that justice and equality bring happiness, but if we abolish the suspense, enmity, and struggle that come from inequality, we would eradicate the very obstacles that allow the will to power to feel the pleasure of overcoming. So, stepping right into this next section of the book, we are instantly forced to confront a worldview where everything you've been taught to view as, good or selfless or moral is actually just a disguised power play.
Right, it completely flips the script.
Yeah, we are looking at a philosophy where greatness looks a lot like criminality, where altruism is basically a myth, and true power is found in this kind of artistic intoxication. And just to be absolutely clear up front, the notes in the book here pull no punches.
No, they really don't.
They contain some incredibly intense anti-democratic and frankly extreme views. We aren't here to endorse or attack them. We're just impartially unpacking the underlying logic of the arguments exactly as they're written in the text.
Exactly. There's a really profound and honestly pretty uncomfortable dismantling of the cages humanity has built for itself. And to understand how the book views the internal mind, we first have to examine how it views the external structures of society.
The physical cages, basically.
Right. Let's look at an institution that is as universally normalized as marriage. The book argues that in its original aristocratic form, so think of ancient Sparta, or the ruling dynasties of 18th century Europe, like the Habsburgs' marriage had absolutely nothing to do with romantic love.
Nothing at all.
Not even a little mutual sympathy. It was this coldly calculated mechanism designed specifically for the breeding forth of the race and maintaining a very fixed, definite type of ruler.
Wow.
Yeah. Husband and wife were essentially sacrifice. First, for the biological interest of the species, and secondly, for the political interest of a particular ruling class.
That coldness, though, that calculating biological lucidity, is precisely what modern warm-blooded society just completely shudders at. I mean, we are so deeply conditioned by the idea of romantic love as the ultimate foundation for a partnership.
Oh, absolutely.
So, viewing marriage merely as a tool for genetic and political preservation feels entirely alien to us. But from the perspective of the book, building an entire social institution on something as fleeting as personal affection is just a massive sign of structural weakness.
It's seen as a decadence, and the book applies that exact same ruthless structural lens to the concept of crime and punishment.
Right.
Because if aristocratic marriage is how society attempts to systematically breed the strong, then the criminal justice system is how society handles the strong who refuse to be domesticated.
So wait, how does it define the criminal then?
Well, the book posits that a criminal is fundamentally a rebel against the social system. In a robust Renaissance-style era, a criminal was often just a really flourishing specimen of humanity whose natural drives were just out of step with the ruling order.
They just didn't fit the mold.
Exactly. The text actually explicitly references Fyodor Dostoevsky's observations from his time in a Siberian penal colony. Dostoevsky noted that the inmates, the murderers, the thieves, were actually the strongest, most resilient, and most valuable portion of the Russian people.
That is such a wild thought.
It is. They had this raw vitality that civilized society just couldn't contain. But in our modern, heavily policed system, the book argues that society essentially starves and stunts these individuals.
Okay, let's unpack this a bit. It's almost like viewing the modern criminal as a rogue hacker who refuses to be constrained by an artificial operating system.
That's a great way to put it.
And society tries to patch that system with what we call punishment. But according to the logic here, that punishment says much more about society's deep-seated fear than it does about the hacker's inherent immorality, right?
Spot on. The ruling class isn't dispensing some kind of cosmic justice. They are simply suppressing a revolt to protect their own comfort.
Which brings us to the core mechanism of that comfort. Because the book views the modern concepts of socialism and democracy with intense hostility.
Oh, intense is an understatement. The philosopher views the demand for equal rights as nothing more than the unfettering of laziness, fatigue, and weakness.
Right, because he argues that society and its laws are intentionally designed by the weak to neuter the strong.
Exactly. He actually says he desires what he calls the 100 swords of Damocles to hang over life.
The 100 swords.
Yeah.
Meaning constant danger.
Yes, constant extreme danger. The logic is that only under extreme danger, only when you face lethal resistance, do you truly learn to move with agility, to master yourself, and to become a sovereign individual. Peace and universal equality, in this view, just act as a sedative that breeds mass mediocrity.
And the text diagnoses this push for equality with a highly specific psychological condition, which it calls resentful pessimism.
Right, it's not just a disagreement about economics.
No, it's a psychological inversion. The idea is that those who are weak or struggling are so revolted by their own lack of power that they desperately need a scapegoat. They can't accept their own biological or social inferiority, so they blame the structure of society.
They point to the wealthy or the exceptionally gifted.
Exactly. And they essentially say, it is a moral sin for you to be born in favorable circumstances while I suffer. They literally invent the concept of guilt specifically to make the strong feel ashamed of their own strength.
And that is the exact pivot point of the philosopher's argument right there. Because if society uses the physical threat of prison to control the rebel hacker we talked about earlier, it uses the psychological concept of morality to control them from the inside out.
It's a two-pronged attack.
Exactly. And this leads us directly into the book's total dismantling of morality itself. The text makes this staggeringly bold proposition. There are no such things as moral or immoral actions.
They just don't exist.
Right, they are purely imaginary constructs.
Which fundamentally upends our entire understanding of human agency. Because the book argues that the entire concept of free will is a historical fraud. It wasn't discovered, it was invented, primarily by the priest class, for the express purpose of punishment and revenge.
Let's walk through the mechanism of how that actually works, because it's brilliant. Think about the physical world. If the heavy rock falls off a cliff and crushes your foot, you don't put the rock on trial.
Right, you don't sue the rock.
You don't call the rock evil. You just recognize it as a continuous flow of natural physical forces, what the book calls becoming. In that state of nature, no one is to blame for who they are. You aren't to blame for your biological drives any more than a tiger is to blame for having sharp claws.
But the priest class couldn't have that.
No. Historically, they wanted to assert power over the strong. And to do that, they needed the moral right to judge and punish. So they artificially separated the doer from the deed.
They invented the soul.
Exactly. They invented the concept of a free-floating soul that chooses to act. By convincing people they have free will, that they actively chose to drop the rock, suddenly you have a moral justification to lock them up, seize their property, and make them feel guilty.
So the entire foundation of moral judgment, the very idea of good and evil, is based on a psychological trick designed to assert control.
That's the argument, yes.
And the book takes this a step further by dissecting our most cherished virtues, specifically altruism. It claims unselfishness is an absolute lie. What we call altruism or pity is actually just a circuitous hidden path to preserving one's own ego and feeling of power.
Right. The book argues that religious traditions, particularly Christianity, made a massive psychological error by declaring natural life instincts like sexuality, covetousness, and the fundamental lust for power as bad.
They demonized human nature.
Exactly. And in their place, they invented an impossible phantom ideal of absolute chastity and selflessness. By placing a moral ban on the most genuine, inescapable human impulses, these traditions forced humanity into a state of permanent self-deception and self-contempt.
Because nobody can actually live up to an entirely selfless ideal.
Exactly. So everyone is forced to feel perpetually guilty.
You know, I struggle with this part of the argument a bit. When I look at history, I see people like monks, activists, or even parents who gave absolutely everything away for a cause or for another person. They literally spent their lives for others.
It's hard to reconcile that.
Yeah, it's really hard to accept that as just a hidden path to ego. How does the book explain those undeniable acts of extreme sacrifice?
It is a really counterintuitive mechanism. The book's answer is that the act of spending oneself or making a massive sacrifice is not an act of selflessness at all. Rather, it is the ultimate proof of an individual's overflowing power.
Overflowing power.
Hmm?
What does that mean in practice?
Well, imagine a river swelling after a massive storm. When it overflows its banks and floods the valley, it isn't doing so out of a selfless desire to water the fields. It is simply so full, so immensely overladen with water, that it cannot contain itself. It must expand.
I see.
When a truly powerful individual loves or sacrifices, they are essentially projecting their own immense surplus of energy onto the world. It's not about losing the self. It's about the self being so rich it can afford to be a spendthrift.
Oh, okay, it's like a sun radiating heat. The sun doesn't burn out of moral pity for the cold planets orbiting it. It burns because it is biologically and physically compelled to explode with energy.
That is a perfect analogy.
And that brings us to a really vital intersection here. If traditional religion and conventional morality are just these decadent tools of suppression, where does a healthy, overflowing spirit actually turn to express itself?
The book's answer is art.
Right. Art is framed as the great counteragent to all decadent human institutions. Where morality subtracts, bleaches, and impoverishes life by making us feel guilty for our nature, art perfects and affirms life in all its raw power.
And to explain how this works, the book divides the artistic state into two fundamental biological conditions, drawing on two ancient Greek gods.
The Apollonian and the Dionysian.
Exactly. First, there is the Apollonian state, named after Apollo, the god of light, structure, and order. This state manifests as a visionary dreamland. Think of a perfectly symmetrical, pristine marble statue or classical architecture. It represents repose, logical and geometrical simplification, and a supreme concentration of power.
And the other side.
Then there is the Dionysian state, named after Dionysus, the god of wine, ecstasy, and chaos. This is the state of orgiastic intoxication. Think of a wild, thumping, chaotic dance party or a massive, overwhelming choral symphony. It gives us the power of grand passion and primal movement.
But the underlying engine for both of these artistic states is a concept the book calls intoxication, right?
Yes, intoxication is key.
And intoxication isn't just a poetic metaphor here. The book treats it as a literal physiological reality. It is an exalted feeling of power inherently tied to sensuality, to a kind of springtime animal vigor, and even to cruelty.
It's a very physical state.
Right. The true artist must be physically vigorous, overladen with energy, and capable of extreme, almost dangerous susceptibility to the world around them. Think of the artist like a human lightning rod.
Oh, I like that.
They are so hypersensitive that they absorb every tiny static charge of emotion, tension, and sensation in the air. They build up this immense internal pressure until they have absolutely no choice but to unleash a massive, brilliant lightning strike. It's almost an involuntary biological explosion of form.
And that physiological tension is absolutely vital to understanding the philosopher's view of the creator. The book actually makes a fascinating clinical comparison between the artist and the hysteric.
Hysteric, like a medical condition.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It argues both share an extreme irritability, an unconscious compulsion to mimic their surroundings, and an absolute burning need to discharge tension. They are both incredibly sensitive to stimuli.
So what's the difference between them then?
Mastery. The crucial defining difference is mastery. The true artist has the power and the wealth of spirit to master this internal chaos without being destroyed by it. The hysteric is overwhelmed by the storm. The artist imposes law, form, and architecture upon their own frenzied states.
Which dictates exactly how the book defines beauty and ugliness. Beauty isn't some abstract, objective, mathematical truth hanging in the sky. Beauty is a biological increase in the feeling of power.
It's deeply tied to survival.
Exactly. When we look at something and call it beautiful, it is actually our deepest self-preservative instincts recognizing something that is life-promoting and structurally sound. Ugliness, conversely, signifies decadence, contradiction, and faulty coordination.
It depresses us physically.
Right? It literally robs us of our strength. Art, therefore, is the conquest of ugliness. It is the highest sign of power manifesting itself by forcing opposing chaotic elements into a beautiful, cohesive whole.
And this brings us to a really profound tension in the later sections of the book. While art is held up as the highest possible human ideal, the philosopher is bitterly disappointed by the art of his own era.
He really tears into modern culture.
He offers an incredibly harsh critique. He claims that modern art no longer affirms life, but relies instead on tyrannizing the audience. Because the modern public is exhausted, overworked, and absent-minded, artists can no longer rely on subtlety, structural perfection, or quiet mastery.
They have to shout to be heard.
Exactly. To get any reaction at all from a numb populace, modern artists must use brutal coloration, overwhelming masses, and extreme passions.
You know, you can easily draw a line from that critique straight to our modern media landscape. Think about algorithm-driven social media or massive CGI-heavy blockbusters. They bombard our senses with rapid cuts, deafening sound design, and extreme emotional stakes because we are too distracted and exhausted to appreciate a slow, methodical piece of art.
It's the exact same dynamic.
And the book points a very specific historical finger here, fiercely critiquing the composer Richard Wagner. It claims Wagner's highly celebrated dramatic music is actually just formlessness. It's literature disguised as music.
The book is merciless with Wagner.
It really is. Wagner is described not as a true musical architect, but as a cunning priest or a somnambulist, a sleepwalker acting on pure unconscious instinct rather than waking, masterful logic. He hypnotizes an exhausted audience, relying on what the book calls the courage of despair, because he fundamentally lacks genuine musical discipline.
Right. And to contrast this heavy manipulative style, the book praises the French composer Jacques Offenbach as a true musical genius.
Offenbach, that's an interesting contrast.
It is, but Offenbach is celebrated because his music is free, intellectual, and wanton. He achieves perfection without what the philosopher bitterly refers to as the heady, moralizing slime of German Romanticism.
The slime, wow.
Yeah, the text argues Offenbach possesses an intellect akin to Voltaire's. He doesn't need to titillate or overwhelm the listener with massive walls of sound. He creates with a divine ease and facility, achieving a mathematical simplicity that Wagner entirely lacks.
I think many people would instinctively push back on this because it's wild to hear Wagner described as a failure of art. I mean, isn't Wagner universally acclaimed precisely for his massive emotional depth and for pushing the absolute boundaries of what orchestral music could express? Why does the book see this overwhelming theatrical emotion as a weakness rather than a monumental strength?
Because for this philosophy, relying on sheer emotion and dramatic theatricality is a crutch. It's an emergency exit for an artist who lacks the foundational power to create true law and order within the music itself. Wagner basically caters to the mob's desire to be overwhelmed.
He gives them what they want.
Right. He uses the suspense of theater and the stimulation of raw nerves to hide the fact that he cannot build a structurally perfect musical edifice. True art, what the book calls the grand style, does not beg for the audience's emotional reaction.
The grand style?
Yes, the grand style stands like a defiant, isolated rock. It scorns to please. It commands rather than persuades. It masters inner chaos to become simple, unequivocal, and mathematical. Wagner's music, in this view, is the art of a sick, decadent society that desperately needs a narcotic to feel alive, whereas the grand style is the expression of a healthy, triumphant society that demands perfection.
We've journeyed through an intensely challenging intellectual landscape today. We've traced the concept of the will to power from the external societal cages of calculated marriage and criminal justice, through the systematic dismantling of moral selflessness and free will, straight to what the book sees as the absolute peak of human existence, the intoxicating, life-affirming power of art. We've mapped how the text strips away our most comforting cultural illusions, breaking down our deepest beliefs to reveal the raw, driving biological forces underneath. Why does understanding this perspective matter to you? Because it challenges you to relentlessly interrogate your own motives. When you perform a so-called good deed, is it truly selfless, or are you secretly exercising your own power and ego? When you look at the media and art you consume daily, is it truly elevating you, commanding you toward perfection, or is it just tyrannizing an exhausted mind with heavy, manipulative emotions?
It demands a total, unflinching reevaluation of how we navigate the world and judge ourselves. The book claims that the very concepts of free will and guilt were merely invented by those seeking control, specifically so that human nature could be judged and punished. It forces us to confront a radical hypothetical. If you were to wake up tomorrow and fully embrace what the philosopher calls the innocence of becoming, if you completely and utterly banished the ideas of cosmic guilt, moral blame, and punishment from your mind, what would our justice system or even your most intimate personal relationships actually look like?
The book presents a radically unconventional redefinition of art and aesthetics, one that entirely discards the traditional method of categorizing art by historical eras.
Right, or by stylistic movements. It just completely throws those out the window.
Exactly. Instead, it divides art strictly by the psychological and really the physiological state of the creator at the exact moment of creation.
Yes, and the foundational question the book asks is simply this. Is the art born from a state of hunger, or is it born from a state of superabundance?
Which is such a profound psychological pivot when you think about it. I mean, we're no longer looking at the canvas or listening to the symphony to understand its form.
No, we're analyzing the specific vitality of the artists themselves. The book categorizes art born from hunger as romanticism.
And we should clarify for you, the listener, this is not the romanticism of love letters or picturesque landscapes that you might immediately think of.
Not at all. In the specific context of this book, the romantic artist is driven by a deep, gnawing dissatisfaction with themselves and with reality.
They are seeking, desiring, and fundamentally they are lacking something.
Right. Let's unpack the mechanics of that dissatisfaction. The book points to massive historical figures like the philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer and the composer Richard Wagner.
It uses them as the ultimate examples of this romantic pessimism. It describes this type of creator as having the tyrannical will of the great sufferer.
Yes. If you look at Schopenhauer's philosophy, it is predicated on the idea that life is inherent suffering and that the human will is a source of endless, unfulfilled torment.
And Wagner's music, similarly, is often characterized by this agonizing, unresolved yearning. I mean, they are in pain, they are angry at the world.
Exactly. Their artistic impulse is actually a desire for destruction or even revenge. They want to stamp the image of their own torment onto the fabric of reality itself.
Which is fascinating, but also incredibly dark.
It is. This reactive nature is why the romantic wants to tear down the present. They might look backward to a mythical, idealized past or forward to some utopian escape.
Because the present moment is just utterly unbearable to them.
Right. Now, you have to contrast this with what the book calls classicism or apotheosis art.
Which is the art of superabundance.
Exactly. The classic artist creates not because they lack something, but because they have entirely too much.
They are just overflowing with gratitude, power, and a profound, unconditional love for existence, exactly as it is.
Yeah. So, okay, let's unpack this with an analogy. It's the difference between creating art because you are starving and angry at the world, needing to tear it down.
Versus creating art because your cup is so overflowing with vitality that you want to freeze time and immortalize the beauty of the present moment.
That's a perfect way to put it. The book cites figures like Homer, the painter Rubens, and the writer Goethe as these apotheosis artists.
When you look at a Rubens painting, you see fleshy, vibrant, dynamic figures that just exude this biological wealth.
And when you read Homer, even the brutal, agonizing violence of the Trojan War is glorified. It's transfigured into something magnificent.
Right. They look at reality with all its flaws and say an unconditional yay to it. But we reach a rather severe intellectual knot here.
We do.
If classicism is about this ultimate overflowing strength and a yay saying to life, why does the book simultaneously argue that a love of tragedy is the ultimate symptom of strength?
To resolve that apparent paradox, we really have to look at how the book systematically dismantles Aristotle's foundational theory of tragedy.
Which is a huge paradigm shift.
It is. For centuries, following Aristotle's Poetics, you have likely been taught that tragedy is meant to evoke depressing emotions.
Specifically fear and pity, right.
Exactly, fear and pity, in order to purge us of them through catharsis. The book dismisses this entirely.
Just throws it out completely.
It argues that if tragedy merely provoked fear and pity, it would be an art form fundamentally hostile to life.
It would act as a depressant, like a tool of biological and psychological decline that weakens and discourages the audience,
making them much less capable of facing reality. The text pushes this so far as to suggest we could measure this cold-bloodedly using a dynamometer.
A dynamometer? That's a physical device used to measure grip strength and physical force, right?
Yes. The book argues that if you were to hook a truly strong, overflowing individual up to a dynamometer while they watched a harrowing tragedy like Hamlet or Oedipus,
the needle wouldn't drop. It would actually rise.
Exactly. The tragedy doesn't depress their physical vitality. It actively energizes them.
Wow. So for the strong, overflowing individual, tragedy operates as a potent tonic.
Precisely. The tragic artist, who is the truly classical creator in the book's framework, possesses a nature deep and robust enough to look directly into the most terrible parts of the universe.
The evil, the questionable aspects of existence.
Right, and they can still say yay. They do not need the world to be morally sanitized.
They don't need a happy ending to find it beautiful?
No. Art, in this highest sense, is presented as the great anti-nihilistic force.
Because the book posits that reality is inherently cruel, contradictory, and without inherent sense.
Yes, and therefore, art is a necessary illusion. It's a supreme transfiguration of that cruelty, without which reality would be utterly unlivable.
The strong individual uses the tragedy to practice their own resilience, finding joy in their ability to withstand the terror of existence without breaking.
Which brings us to a massive and highly controversial shift in the text.
Right. Because if this yay-saying vitality is the ultimate measure of an individual's worth, the book makes a terrifying leap.
It does. It applies this exact same aesthetic and psychological metric to human biology and politics.
It argues that all human value must be assessed on this underlying strength, which brings us to the book's highly rigid concept of the order of rank.
We are moving here from aesthetics into a very severe social and biological hierarchy.
The book completely dismisses the modern political ideals of universal suffrage, democracy, and the inherent equality of human beings.
It is entirely anti-egalitarian. The text explicitly states that quanta of power alone determine rank.
The book observes the modern trajectory of society, right? The increasing economic unification, the drive toward general welfare.
The leveling down of humanity.
Yeah.
And it interprets this not as progress, but as the creation of a vast machine.
It envisions average mankind being turned into highly efficient, deeply specialized, but ultimately small cogs in an enormous piece of economic clockwork.
When society is optimized purely for safety, comfort, and equivalence, the individual is sanded down to fit a stationary average state.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, but also highly controversial. We must examine this impartially to understand the architecture of the book's thought.
Absolutely.
The book argues that equal rights are actually a form of superstition. It actively calls for a separation of what it terms a higher species from this leveled down mass.
Introducing the concept of the Superman or the synthetic man.
Right. So how does the book construct a justification for such a rigid, unapologetic hierarchy without simply presenting an endorsement of tyrannical oppression to you, the listener?
Well, the justification it builds is fundamentally biological and economic. The book does not view this vast machinery of average, specialized people as something to be despised or destroyed.
Wait, really? It doesn't want to dismantle the machine?
Quite the opposite. It argues that a high culture absolutely requires a broad, strongly consolidated base of mediocrity upon which to stand.
Think of it as a structural necessity, like building a pyramid.
Exactly. You cannot have the emergence of a higher, stronger, more intellectually and physically robust species of human,
The synthetic man.
right, without the stable, predictable, and highly functional machinery provided by the average masses.
The machine goes to work, follows the rules, and creates the economic surplus.
And that surplus provides the necessary foundation and the economic leisure required for the exception to cultivate their higher, more demanding mode of existence.
Okay, following the book's internal logic, the strong are naturally superior in their power, their psychological depth, and their rank.
Yes,
But this raises an immediate, glaring contradiction within the text itself.
it's a huge paradox.
If the strong are so vastly superior, why, according to the book's own diagnosis, do the weak currently rule modern Europe?
Right. How did this vast machinery of average cogs manage to completely subvert and domesticate the lords of the earth?
Exactly. The book provides a fascinating sociological autopsy of this exact phenomenon.
It claims the weak and the sick triumph, not through physical dominance, obviously, but through sheer numbers.
And the weaponization of sympathy.
Yes, and a very specific, calculating kind of intellect that the book terms malice.
We must look at how this functions mechanically. When an individual lacks physical strength or inherent power, they are denied the use of direct physical force to assert their will.
Right? They can't just overpower you. So to survive, they are forced to develop psychological cunning.
They become intellectually agile, shiftily adaptable, and incredibly patient. They learn to lay traps rather than fighting head-on.
The book contrasts this by describing the truly strong races as squandering races.
So, what does this all mean? Let's use an analogy. It sounds like the book views the strong as high-performance sports cars that burn out their engines going 200 miles an hour.
While the weak are the reliable sedans that ultimately inherit the roads.
Exactly. The strong are capable of breathtaking speeds and monumental achievements, but they are historically venturous. They're driven by a lust for power and massive expenditures of energy.
They decimate themselves in wars, they endure great emotional perturbations, and consequently, they squander their vitality.
They are incredibly expensive to maintain, biologically speaking, and rarely last.
The weak, on the other hand, prioritize permanence, caution, and predictability. Because they do not expend their energy in grand, squandering gestures, they endure.
They outlast the strong.
But mere survival is not dominance. The primary weapon the weak use to actively subjugate the remaining strong, according to the book, is the invention of morality itself.
Specifically what the text calls slave morality.
Yes.
I follow the logic of the squandering versus the enduring, but the physical reality of it requires a mechanism.
What do you mean?
Well, if the strong are inherently more powerful, a whole society of the weak shouldn't be able to physically stop them. There must be a psychological speed bump they're using to slow the strong down.
Ah, yes.
How exactly does this herd enforce its will and tame a nature that is biologically driven to dominate?
The psychological speed bump is guilt. Guilt, enforced by what the book calls the social mishmash.
The social mishmash, how does that operate?
It operates as a pervasive, invisible atmospheric pressure. The collective instinct of the herd tightly binds the strong by establishing a rigid moral framework.
Where altruism, modesty, and equality are heralded as the ultimate good.
Right, while ambition, dominance, and self-assertion are labeled as evil.
By weaponizing this moral framework, the herd forces these inherently powerful natures into a state of profound hypocrisy.
It gives them a bad conscience regarding their own natural instincts. The herd essentially convinces the lion that it's morally wrong to eat meat.
Wow. And this societal pressure supervises everyone, demanding that all individuals, regardless of their inherent capacity, conform to mechanical, predictable duties.
The text points out that this pressure is so absolute that even the privileged classes, even the undeniable geniuses of the age, now have to flatter the mob.
They have to camouflage themselves in the virtues of the weak just to maintain any semblance of influence or even survive socially.
The book specifically names figures like the French writer Victor Hugo to illustrate this.
Hugo, a man of immense literary power and genius, utilized his art to become a herald for the feelings of the downtrodden mob.
writing sweeping epics that champion the suppressed and marginalized.
But the book views this not as a triumph of empathy, but as evidence of how completely the strong have been forced to adopt liberal, mediocre values to appease the herd.
Exactly. So since the old, overtly dominant strong types burn themselves out through their own squandering nature,
And since the current era is entirely saturated by the moral atmospheric pressure of the herd,
the book pivots to the future. It asks, what does the new higher type look like?
what it eventually calls the nobleman. What does he look like in the midst of this thoroughly leveled down democratic society?
How does one maintain superabundance in a world optimized for cogs?
Right. The book spends a great deal of time detailing the severe, highly internal life of this new nobleman.
And you must be clear here, the book explicitly states this has absolutely nothing to do with traditional aristocratic titles, wealth, or lineage.
Oh, it openly mocks the Almanac de Gotha, which was the definitive directory of European royalty. It treats it as a superficial catalog of names.
Nobility, in this text, is entirely a matter of blood, instinct, and a severe, almost punishing psychological discipline.
So what are the actual characteristics of these lords of the earth?
The anatomy of this nobleman is characterized by very specific, deliberate traits. The book mentions a slow step and a slow glance.
A slow step. This is a person who refuses to be rushed by the frantic pace of the modern machine.
They are not easily startled, they are not quick to admire, and they're deeply suspicious of anything that demands an immediate emotional reaction.
And on top of that, they possess an inherent capacity to endure poverty, want, and even severe illness without complaint.
They do not view suffering as an injustice to be remedied by society. They view it as an internal test of their own hardness and structural integrity.
There is also a deep structural emphasis on avoidance. The nobleman actively avoids small honors.
Because they suspect that those who are quick to praise him do so out of a false sense of equality.
An attempt to pull him down to their level through familiarity.
Exactly. Living in a society of the herd, the nobleman has an absolute inherent need for disguises.
They live an incognito existence. They value formal courtesy immensely.
But they use politeness not as a tool of warmth, but as a defensive wall.
A sheet of glass to maintain an ironical, unbridgeable distance from both the merely gifted productive classes and the mediocre masses.
Philosophically, this translates to a total rejection of the ethical frameworks that govern the modern world.
Like the utilitarianism of John Stuart Mill.
Right, the idea of seeking the greatest happiness for the greatest number. And it also rejects the fundamental premise of the Golden Rule.
Doing unto others as you would have them do unto you. The book finds the very concept of reciprocity to be intensely vulgar.
To understand why, you have to look at the underlying assumption of reciprocity. It assumes an inherent equivalence between individuals.
It assumes that my action and your action are interchangeable currency.
But the nobleman operates from a foundational conviction that his actions are entirely unique to him.
When he acts, he does not believe anyone else is biologically or psychologically capable of doing the same.
And therefore, he can never truly be paid back in equal measure. He does not covet other people's virtues.
And he certainly does not expect the herd to comprehend his. It sounds like an incredibly isolating existence.
It is. This profound sense of uniqueness inevitably leads to an incredibly isolating, almost suffocating existence.
The book mentions the possibility of the nobleman having hundreds of guests, showing great formal hospitality, but perhaps not having a single true friend.
Is this profound loneliness, this total separation from the warmth and comfort of human community, a choice for the nobleman or a necessity?
The book frames it as a strict, unyielding necessity. The nobleman must isolate himself to protect his instincts from being infected by the pervasive leveling views of the herd.
To maintain his quanta of power, he deliberately seeks out heavy responsibilities and embraces a life of asceticism.
However, this is not the asceticism of a monk seeking religious salvation or moral purity.
No, it is, in the book's specific terminology, a gymnastic of the will.
You might wonder what that actually looks like in practice. It means practicing fasting not just from food, but from pleasures, from reading, and notably from amiability.
It is the conscious endurance of sitting at a dinner party, hearing a mediocre opinion, and deliberately choosing not to smile.
Not to nod along to smooth the social friction. It is proving to oneself that you are in absolute command of your own impulses.
Immune to the herd's demand for conformity. He tests his ability to promise, his ability to keep his word.
His ability to remain cold and rational even when faced with the powerful, socially rewarded impulse to perform a superficially heroic or generous deed out of pity.
Pity, remember, is the weapon of the weak.
The crucial element here is that this new nobleman does not want to destroy the mediocre masses.
Right, he has no revolutionary desire to burn down the machine of society. As we discussed regarding the pyramid structure, he absolutely needs them.
He utilizes their peaceful, rule-following, highly ordered democratic society as a stable stepping stone.
But Hurd's predictable world is the necessary, quiet foundation that affords him the psychological and physical space to achieve a much higher mode of existence.
A vastly more dangerous and entirely supermoral mode of existence. He feeds off the stability they create.
The book leaves you with a chilling and profound vision of the future.
It asks a question that strikes at the very underlying architecture of modern civilization. Is it not high time to consciously start rearing this opposite, higher type of human? We spend all our energy, all our political capital, and all our moral focus perfecting society, making it safe, making it equal, making it a frictionless, highly efficient economic machine. But what if this perfectly safe, democratic society you are building is merely the soil? You have to ask yourself, what happens to the world when the lords of the earth finally arrive, look at the perfectly ordered, comfortable lives we have built, and realize we are nothing more than the foundation upon which they intend to stand? So if you strip away all the comforting illusions of modern infrastructure, if you look past the carefully manicured political systems, the supply chains, and the polite social contracts that you and I rely on every single day, you are left with a single incredibly heavy proposition.
Right. It's the question that sits at the very center of this book.
Yeah.
Just waiting to drop like an anvil.
Exactly. I mean, how shall the earth as a whole be ruled? And to what end should mankind be reared?
It's staggering because when you sit with that quietly in your own mind, you realize we're systematically dismantling every moral safety net humanity has built over the last 2 millennia.
Yeah. We are examining a framework that views our current ethical standard, what the book terms herd morality, not as a triumph of civilization, but as an active, degenerative biological threat.
Because this herd morality, it preaches the absolute equality of rights, right?
Yeah.
It preaches an unconditional pity for all sufferers.
It's a desperate collective striving for what the book calls a green meadow happiness, like a state defined entirely by security, ease, and the absolute eradication of danger.
But the core assertion we're dealing with here is that this exact safety is actively destroying human potential.
I mean, look around your own life. You, the listener, likely live in a temperature-controlled environment. You drink hyper-purified water.
You eradicate every pest from your home. You mitigate every physical risk before even stepping outside.
Right. You are living as a pampered hothouse plant. And the result is an organism that looks aesthetically pleasing, sure, but its cellular structure is severely compromised.
It lacks the internal density to survive a single night exposed to the raw elements.
Because the premise here is that man is fundamentally a primeval forest plant. And to grow a primeval forest plant, you cannot use a hothouse.
No, you require extreme danger. You need severity, violence, and deep systemic inequality.
Think about the botanical mechanics of a tree growing on a cliff face. The tree physically strengthens only when it is continuously battered by environmental stress.
Right, the gale force winds create micro tears in the cellular tissue of the trunk.
And those tears heal to form thicker, infinitely more rigid wood. Without that violent wind, the roots never receive the biological signal to anchor themselves deeper into the earth.
And that botanical reality maps perfectly onto the psychological mechanics we are dissecting in this book. If we follow that logic to its absolute conclusion, the implications for humanity are monumental.
To rear a new ruling caste, what the book identifies as the future lords of the earth, the baseline danger of the human situation must be artificially and enormously increased.
Because you cannot cultivate primeval, root-deep strength in a society that is optimized for comfortable, frictionless mediocrity.
It requires a profound psychological shift, a complete transvaluation of values.
Yes, you have to consider what this actually means in practice. It involves the slow, methodical liberation of a vast array of deeply slandered human instincts.
Instincts that we've been taught to fear.
Exactly. For centuries, herd morality has suppressed the will to power, the lust for dominion, secrecy, seductive art, even cruelty, automatically labeling them as evil.
But in this framework, those exact instincts are the vital nutrients required for structural growth.
And what is particularly cold and analytical about this approach is its view on modern European democracy.
Right, because it does not look at democratic equality as a moral triumph.
Not at all, or as an end state of human evolution. Instead, it views the democratic homogenization of people as a highly efficient, supple instrument.
It's just a tool. A vast democratic society creates a pliable, predictable, and leveled material.
It essentially prepares the ground and smooths the earth for a new aristocracy of artist tyrants who can take hold of that democratized mass and stamp their supreme will upon it for millennia.
Well, if a homogenized democracy is merely the raw clay, then logically we have to examine the hands that mold it.
We have to dissect the psychology of the great man.
Because the portrait drawn here is chillingly detached. It entirely strips away the philanthropic, benevolent veneer we usually demand of our leaders.
First off, the great man is physiologically colder. He's harder.
He operates entirely free from the fear of public opinion.
Which means the social pressures that govern your daily choices. The fear of being disliked, the deep evolutionary desire for group approval, they simply do not register in his neurology.
He possesses a vast, broad consistency of will that spans entire decades. It allows him to coldly reject all the small, immediate gratifications that the herd considers divine.
But here is the most structurally difficult part to reconcile. He has no compassion in art.
None. He does not view other human beings as equals to be loved or protected. He views them strictly as instruments to be used.
Raw material, to be shaped toward his broader architectural vision.
And because of that, he operates in an impenetrable loneliness. He acts as his own supreme final judge, and there is no appellate court above his own intellect.
Consider the cognitive mechanics of deception here. Conforming to the shared reality of the herd requires mere obedience, but lying requires a massive active exertion of spirit and willpower to construct a secondary reality.
So the great man naturally prefers to wear a mask. When he is not engaged in deep dialogue with his own soul, he remains completely hidden from you.
He has to be.
But let's analyze this critically for a second. A completely isolated man, devoid of compassion, who views everyone around him merely as cogs in his own machine, logically, doesn't that make him functionally disconnected from the very reality he is trying to shape?
I see where you're going with this.
I mean, doesn't this make the great man entirely miserable? He sounds like a monster. How does a human mind sustain that absolute loneliness without fracturing into madness?
Well, that is precisely the structural tension we must unpack. It is a harsh, brutal reality, and your revulsion to it is a mathematically predictable response.
A response generated from within herd morality itself.
Exactly. But we must accurately diagnose where the great man's suffering actually originates. The book makes it clear he does not suffer from his isolation.
Right. He suffers from the foolish pity of mediocre spirits.
Yes. When ordinary people perceive his impenetrable loneliness, they misinterpret it through their own fragile lens. They think, oh, if I were that alone, I would be miserable.
So they project their own weakness onto him. They attempt to save him.
They try to forcefully integrate him into comfortable, reliable society, genuinely believing they have a moral obligation to meddle in his solitude.
And that officiousness, that constant buzzing interference, is what actually threatens his focus.
To understand how his mind remains intact, we have to examine the sharp distinction the book makes between two types of philosophers.
There are the scholars, the academic laborers.
Their function is merely to abbreviate the past. They look backward, they categorize, index, and summarize what has already occurred.
But the true lawgivers are commanders. They stand at the vanguard of time, looking into the abyss of the future, and they dictate, thus shall it be.
And to wield that level of command without his psyche snapping, the great man must actively synthesize a host of fiercely antagonistic instincts.
Think of how a massive stone arch functions in structural engineering. It does not stand because the stones are perfectly at rest.
No, it stands because the stones are constantly pushing against each other with immense opposing pressure.
The tension itself is what creates the structural integrity. The great man, much like the psychological profile of Shakespeare, which the book uses as an example, contains the highest, most intellectual desires and the basest, most ruthless instincts.
He does not eradicate his cruelty or his lust for power. He subdues and harnesses them.
He redirects that violent energy into the severe discipline required to create new laws.
He is that broad arch spanning two distant banks. He endures his extreme loneliness not as a punishment, but as the necessary quiet space required to sustain that immense internal pressure.
But if he is sustaining that level of internal pressure, if he is literally a living architecture of opposing forces, then his worldview, his perception of existence itself, has to be radically different from ours to justify holding that tension.
It has to be.
If you reject pity and you reject the comforting illusions of the herd, how do you mathematically process the raw suffering of the world?
This brings us to the Dionysian state, which is framed through this intensely fascinating concept, the pessimism of strength.
Let's trace the evolutionary psychology of this. When primitive humans encountered evil, which was realistically just the unpredictable cruelty of nature, disease, sudden violence, they were terrified.
They lacked the cognitive power to process random suffering, so they invented religious structures.
They created gods to make treaties with the unknown, or to categorize their suffering as a moral punishment. It was a cognitive coping mechanism just to make the pain bearable.
But as human intellect advances, the structurally sound mind, the strong man, no longer requires a metaphysical safety net.
He doesn't need to invent a god to justify why pain exists.
Instead, he learns to actually enjoy the accidental, the uncertain, and the terrible as fundamental, necessary properties of reality.
There is a precise surgical contrast drawn in the book between two symbolic figures, Dionysus and Christ on the cross.
Yes, this is a crucial distinction. The image of Christ on the cross is analyzed as a curse upon life.
It represents a fundamental objection to the physical world, right?
Yeah.
A plea for deliverance from earthly suffering into some peaceful, abstract afterlife.
Dionysus, however, represents the absolute ecstatic affirmation of all physical life, encompassing its most excruciating agonies.
It is the eternal will to procreation and destruction simultaneously. But to actually map that onto human consciousness requires a staggering cognitive leap.
It does.
Think of it through a strictly meteorological lens. The book describes it as forces accumulating in the mind like an overcast sky. Barometric pressure building across the atmosphere to an agonizing degree, just waiting to violently discharge as lightning.
It's a highly volatile state.
But clinically speaking, how does a human being look at the raw atrocities of history, the wars, the systemic violence, the profound personal losses, and say yay to them without their psychological framework completely collapsing?
They achieve it by adopting a strictly anti-metaphysical, deeply interconnected artistic view of the world's mechanics.
Explain the physics of that.
Well, to understand how one survives the Dionysian affirmation, you have to look at the physics of time and consequence. Nothing exists in a vacuum. Every single event, every microsecond of history is inextricably chained to the next.
Okay.
Therefore, if you, the listener, have ever experienced a single moment of profound clarity or joy, if your nervous system has registered one instance of genuine triumph, you are logically bound to affirm the entirety of the eternal chain that produced it.
Wow. Because you cannot selectively extract the joy without affirming the agony that preceded it.
Exactly. The agony was the necessary physical prerequisite for the joy's existence. It is a closed mathematical equation.
And this is precisely why there is such a cold, systematic dismantling in the book of Jean-Jacques Rousseau's concept of the good man and the broader Romantic movement.
Romanticism is diagnosed here as a pathology of the weak.
Because it's born from a hatred of rigorous, severe, aristocratic culture. It is an attempt to pamper humanity and apply a soft, sentimental moral filter over the brutal mechanics of nature.
But true greatness of soul is functionally inseparable from intellectual greatness. And intellectual greatness demands a clear-eyed embrace of the terrible.
You cannot engineer the staggering heights of human achievement, the art, the philosophy, the architectural triumphs, without utilizing the exact same foundational energy that drives human cruelty and suffering.
They are woven from the exact same raw kinetic fabric.
So the Dionysian state is not just a reckless, chaotic celebration of violence.
No, it is the supreme calculated realization that the perishable nature of existence, the endless grinding cycle of creation and annihilation, is not a tragic flaw to be escaped.
It is an aesthetically profound process.
It is the pessimism of strength, where a mind possesses such an overflow of vital energy that it actively requires resistance, friction, and pain as the necessary stimuli to continue overcoming its own limitations.
So if the Dionysian worldview requires you to logically affirm the entirety of existence, including its absolute horrors, we have to look for the ultimate stress test of that affirmation.
Right. If you claim to have this strength, how is it verified?
Which brings us to the most severe cosmological thesis in the framework, the mechanism of eternal recurrence.
This is not presented as a poetic metaphor to make you appreciate the present moment. It is laid out as a strict physical proof.
Let's detail that proof. Consider the universe as a closed thermodynamic system. It is a definite, fixed, brazen quantum of energy.
It does not expand to infinity in its mass. It grows neither bigger nor smaller.
It is a household without any loss or gain of raw material, and crucially, it lacks any final equilibrium or teleological purpose.
Because if the universe possessed the capacity to reach a state of rest, or if it had a final peaceful goal, it mathematically would have reached it already.
Because the stretch of past time behind us is infinite.
Exactly. So we have infinite time, but a finite number of energy configurations. By the absolute laws of probability within a closed system, every possible combination of matter, every sequence of events, must inevitably repeat an infinite number of times.
Everything that becomes returns forever. There is no escape. Now, I want you to apply this clinically to your own life. Recall your single most agonizing memory, a moment of deep grief, intense physical trauma, or profound, isolating humiliation.
Under this cosmological model, you are not just enduring it once.
No, it is an infinite closed loop. Every pain you have ever felt, every mistake, every atrocity in history will happen again infinitely in the exact same sequence.
It's terrifying.
If the universe is just a cosmic game of chance repeating the exact same suffering forever, isn't that the ultimate paralyzing thought? It's like being trapped on a nightmare carousel. Logically, how does that not immediately paralyze the human nervous system?
It is functionally designed to induce absolute clinical despair, but as a precise evolutionary filtering mechanism.
It is an ideological centrifuge.
Yes, this thought functions as a hammer. It is a crushing gravitational weight. For the psychologically weak, for the degenerate, for those who look at the pain of life and secretly long for non-entity peace or the void, this concept will utterly obliterate them.
It is the heaviest burden the human mind can conceptualize.
But for the great man, the truly Dionysian mind, this exact same thought is the mechanism of his absolute liberation.
How so?
Because to endure the infinite repetition of your own trauma, you must entirely eradicate the concept of necessity as an oppressive external force.
You cannot view the universe as a series of events happening to you.
You must execute a complete transvaluation of all values. When the great man confronts the infinite loop of his own pain and joy, he does not resign himself to it. He actively wills it backward and forward.
He looks at the totality of his life and dictates, was that life? Well then, once more.
This is the clinical definition of amor fati, the love of fate. He doesn't merely tolerate the reality of the closed system. He doesn't avert his eyes or seek a spiritual escape hatch.
He profoundly loves it because he recognizes himself as the active synthesizer of his own values within that eternal cycle.
The hammer of eternal recurrence is the ultimate selective principle. It biologically and psychologically separates those whose internal structures are fundamentally sick of life from those who possess such an overwhelming density of vital power that they demand their exact agonizing existence be locked into repetition for all eternity.
And when we trace the implications of eternal recurrence all the way down to the atomic level of our own psychology, we uncover the final, absolute baseline of existence.
The realization forces us to look inward at the very fabric of our being, which this book defines in final, absolute terms.
When we strip away the moralizing, the pity, and the theological comforts, we see that the universe is not a curated garden managed by a divine architect.
It is a vast, violent sea of forces, storming and raging within itself. It is a mechanism of constant churning exchange, rolling back over incalculable stretches of time.
It builds the most astonishingly complex biological and cultural structures out of the simplest components, and then inexorably grinds them back down.
It returns from multifariousness, meaning the chaotic, infinite variety of individual forms, thoughts, and civilizations, back down into complete, blank uniformity.
And then it repeats, forever blessing itself in its own indestructible cycle.
This relentless churning reality is defined by one single irreducible property. It is the will to power and absolutely nothing else. And you, sitting there, processing these concepts, your mind, your biological drives, your deepest, most hidden instincts, you too are nothing but this will to power and nothing besides.
Therefore, at this point, we must deeply consider what this eternal recurrence means for our own choices, leading right into